Somewhere in the desert, beneath a sky heavy with stars, a stone is moving. It weighs more than 100 men could lift, and yet it glides, slowly, impossibly, across a bed of wet sand, pulled by ropes woven from papyrus fibres and guided by hands that have been doing the same work since before the sun rose that morning. There are no cranes here, no engines, no hydraulic lifts. There is only human ingenuity, and a patience so deep it borders on something sacred. And if you were to stand there in the cool hours before dawn, watching that enormous block of limestone crawl forward 1 cubit at a time, you would begin to understand something that our modern world has largely forgotten, that the greatest structures ever raised on this earth were not built by machines. They were built by people who understood, with a clarity we have lost, what the human body and the human mind are truly capable of when they work together, day after day, year after year, generation after generation. And if you enjoy this kind of quiet journey through the forgotten corners of history, consider subscribing. There is always another story to tell, another mystery to unfold, and I would love nothing more than to share them all with you. Tonight we're going to stand before some of the most extraordinary buildings and monuments ever constructed by human hands. We're going to walk through the quarries where the first stones were cut, follow the roads and waterways along which they were transported, and watch as they were lifted, shaped and fitted into place with a precision that, in many cases, still surpasses what modern construction can achieve. We're going to meet the engineers who designed these structures, the labourers who built them, and the rulers who commissioned them. We're going to examine the tools they used, the techniques they developed, and the organisational systems that allowed tens of thousands of workers to coordinate their efforts over decades of continuous construction. But more than anything, we're going to try to answer a question that has haunted curious minds for thousands of years. How are these massive buildings actually built? It is a question that sounds simple, but the deeper you dig, the more extraordinary the answers become. Because the ancient world was not the primitive stumbling place that our modern arrogance sometimes imagines it to be. The civilizations that built the Great Pyramids, that carved Petra out of living rock, that raised the Parthenon on its hilltop in Athens, that constructed Angkor Wat in the jungles of Cambodia, these were societies of breathtaking sophistication. They possessed mathematical knowledge that would not be surpassed for centuries. They understood principles of engineering and architecture that we are still, to this day, working to fully comprehend. And they accomplished all of this without electricity, without steel, without computers, without any of the technological crutches that we have come to depend upon so completely that we can scarcely imagine building anything without them. The stones of the Great Pyramid at Giza, for example, are fitted together with joints so fine that you cannot slide a sheet of paper between them. The walls of certain Inca fortresses in Peru are composed of enormous boulders, some weighing more than 100 tons, that have been cut and shaped to interlock with one another so perfectly that no mortar was needed to hold them in place. And they have remained standing unmoved for more than 500 years through countless earthquakes that have toppled modern buildings around them. The columns of the Parthenon in Athens are not perfectly straight. They are subtly curved, each one tapering and leaning inward by precisely calculated fractions of a degree, corrections so fine that they were designed to counteract optical illusions created by the human eye at a distance. The architects who designed them understood optics and human perception with a sophistication that borders on the unbelievable. How did they do it? That is the question that has drawn us here tonight, and it is one that we will explore not with haste, but with the kind of slow, careful attention that these ancient builders themselves would have recognized and appreciated. Because if there is one thing that unites all of these extraordinary structures, from the pyramids of Egypt to the temples of Angkor, From the stone circles of Britain to the fortress walls of Sacsayhuaman, it is patience. These were not buildings that were thrown up in a season. They were the work of years, decades, sometimes generations. They were conceived by minds that thought in centuries, not in fiscal quarters. And they were built by hands that understood that the greatest things in life, the things that endure, the things that matter, are never accomplished in a hurry. So let us take our time with them. Let us move slowly as the stones themselves moved and see what we can learn. The story of ancient construction is, at its heart, a story about the relationship between human beings and the earth beneath their feet. Every great structure begins with the land, with stone, with clay, with timber, with the raw materials that the earth offers up to those who know how to find them and how to use them. And the first great challenge of any monumental building project was always the same: finding the right stone. This may sound like a simple task, but it was anything but. The ancient builders did not simply dig wherever was convenient and hope for the best. They were geologists in every meaningful sense of the word. They understood the properties of different types of stone, its hardness, its weight, its tendency to fracture along certain planes, its ability to bear enormous loads without crumbling, its resistance to wind and rain, and the slow grinding of time. They knew which quarries produced limestone that was easy to cut but strong enough to build with, and which produced granite that was nearly indestructible but fiendishly difficult to shape. They knew which stone would hold a sharp edge for decorative carving, and which would weather beautifully over the centuries, its surface softening into gentle curves that caught the light. In Egypt, the builders of the pyramids sourced their stone from multiple quarries, each chosen for a specific purpose. The bulk of the Great Pyramid, the roughly 2.3 million limestone blocks that make up its core, came from quarries located on the Giza plateau itself, just a few hundred meters from the construction site. This was practical, efficient stone, quarried quickly and in its enormous quantities, used to build up the interior mass of the pyramid where no one would ever see it. But the fine outer casing stones, the smooth, gleaming white limestone that originally covered the entire surface of the pyramid and made it shine like a beacon in the desert sun, came from the Tura quarries, located across the Nile on the eastern bank, some 15 kilometers away. Tura limestone was prized throughout the ancient world for its exceptional quality. Fine-grained, smooth, almost luminous, it could be polished to a near-mirror finish that reflected sunlight with dazzling intensity. Getting it to Giza required quarrying it in enormous blocks, transporting it to the riverbank, loading it onto barges, floating it across the Nile during the annual flood season when the river was at its highest and most navigable, and then unloading it and hauling it to the construction site. It was an extraordinary logistical operation, repeated thousands of times over the course of the pyramid's construction. And then there was the granite. The interior chambers of the Great Pyramid, including the famous King's Chamber with its massive ceiling beams, are constructed from red granite quarried at Aswan, nearly 900 kilometers to the south. Aswan granite is among the hardest stones on Earth, incredibly dense and durable, capable of bearing enormous weight without fracturing. The ceiling beams of the King's Chamber each weigh between 25 and 80 tons. Getting them from Aswan to Giza was a feat of transportation that, even by modern standards, would be considered extraordinarily challenging. The Egyptians accomplished it using the Nile as their highway, loading these colossal blocks onto specially constructed barges and floating them downstream over a journey that took weeks. And when they arrived at Giza, they had to be hauled up the growing mass of the pyramid itself and set into position with millimetre precision, deep inside the structure. The quarrying process itself was a marvel of practical engineering. The Egyptians did not have explosives. They did not have power tools. What they had was an intimate understanding of the stone they were working with and a set of remarkably effective techniques for extracting it. For limestone, the primary method was straightforward but labour-intensive. Workers would use copper chisels and wooden mallets to cut channels into the rock face, following the natural bedding planes of the stone. Once a block had been outlined on 3 sides, wooden wedges would be hammered into a series of holes drilled along the bottom edge. These wedges would then be soaked with water. As the wood absorbed the water, it swelled, exerting tremendous lateral pressure on the stone. Slowly, over the course of hours or days, the block would crack free along a clean, even plane, ready to be dressed and moved. For granite, however, this technique was insufficient. Granite is far too hard for copper tools, and its crystalline structure makes it resistant to the kind of controlled fracturing that works so well with sedimentary stone. The Egyptians solved this problem with a tool that was even harder than granite: dolerite. Dolerite is a type of igneous rock, dark and immensely dense, and the Egyptians fashioned it into heavy pounding balls, some weighing as much as 5 or 6 kilograms. Teams of workers would hammer these dolerite balls against the granite face, hour after hour, day after day, slowly pulverizing the stone and creating channels that could eventually be used to free individual blocks. It was brutally hard work, and it was slow. Estimates suggest that a team of workers might remove only a few centimeters of granite per day using this method. But the results were extraordinary. The granite surfaces left behind were remarkably smooth, and the blocks that were freed were shaped with impressive accuracy. Elsewhere in the ancient world, different civilizations developed their own quarrying techniques, each adapted to the specific types of stone available to them and the specific demands of the structures they were building. In the Andes, the Inca builders at sites like Sacsayhuaman and Ollantaytambo worked with andesite and diorite, stones of volcanic origin that are extraordinarily hard and resistant to weathering. The exact methods they used remain a subject of debate among archaeologists, but the evidence suggests a combination of fire setting, heating the stone face with bonfires and then rapidly cooling it with water to cause it to crack and spall, and patient hammering with stone tools. The results they achieved were nothing short of miraculous. The walls of Sacsayhuaman are composed of blocks so enormous, some weighing more than 120 tons, and fitted together so precisely that the joints between them are invisible to the naked eye. No mortar was used, no filler was needed. The stones were shaped to interlock with one another in 3 dimensions, creating a wall that is not only immensely strong, but also remarkably flexible, able to absorb the shock of earthquakes by allowing the individual stones to shift slightly and then settle back into place. In the quarries of ancient Greece, meanwhile, builders developed a system of extraction that was elegant in its simplicity. Greek quarrymen would cut channels around a block using iron picks and chisels, Greece being one of the first civilizations to have access to iron tools in quantity, and then drive iron wedges into a series of holes along the base. By striking these wedges in sequence, moving down the line and back again, they could split a block free along an almost perfectly flat plane. The precision of Greek quarry work is evident in the finished buildings. The individual drums that make up the columns of the Parthenon, for example, are fitted together so precisely that the seams are barely visible, even up close. Each of these quarrying traditions represented the accumulated knowledge of centuries of trial and error, passed down from master to apprentice in an unbroken chain that stretched back to the earliest days of each civilization. The men who worked these quarries were not unskilled labourers. They were craftsmen, specialists who understood the behaviour of stone with an intimacy that no modern textbook can fully convey. They could read the subtle variations in colour and texture that indicated where a block would fracture cleanly and where it was likely to shatter. They could listen to the sound a stone made when struck and know, from the pitch and resonance of the ring, whether it was sound throughout or floored by hidden cracks. They were, in the truest sense of the word, artists, and the stone they freed from the earth was their canvas. But quarrying the stone was only the beginning. Once a block had been extracted, whether it weighed a few hundred kilograms or 100 tons, it had to be moved. And in the ancient world, without trucks, without trains, without any form of mechanical transportation, moving stone was perhaps the single greatest challenge of monumental construction. It was the problem that every ancient civilization had to solve, and the solutions they devised were as varied and ingenious as the cultures that produced them. The simplest method, and the most universal, was the sledge. A sledge is nothing more than a large wooden platform or cradle, fitted with runners on its underside, upon which a stone block could be placed and then dragged across the ground by teams of workers pulling on ropes. It sounds crude, but with the right preparation, it was surprisingly effective. The key was reducing friction between the sledge runners and the ground surface. The Egyptians, as we now know from both archaeological evidence and ancient artwork, did this by pouring water onto the sand ahead of the sledge as it was being pulled. A famous painting from the tomb of Jehuti-Hotep, an ancient Egyptian nobleman who lived around 1900 BCE, shows exactly this scene. A colossal statue being transported on a sledge, pulled by ranks of workers, while a man standing at the front of the sledge pours water from a jar onto the ground ahead. For many years, this painting was interpreted as depicting a ritual libation, a ceremonial offering to the gods. But modern experiments have shown that wetting desert sand reduces its friction by approximately 50%, transforming it from a loose, resistant surface into a firm, compact one over which a loaded sledge can glide with remarkable ease. The Egyptians were not performing a ritual, they were performing physics. Other civilizations used different approaches. In Mesopotamia, where the terrain between quarry sites and building locations was often flat and relatively firm, rollers were sometimes used, cylindrical logs placed beneath a stone block, so that it could be rolled forward rather than dragged. As the block moved forward, the logs that emerged from behind it would be carried to the front and placed ahead of it, creating a continuous rolling surface. This method was faster than sledge dragging on firm ground, but it required a large supply of sturdy timber, a commodity that was not always readily available in the resource-poor landscapes of the ancient Near East. In regions with navigable waterways, transportation by water was often the preferred method, and for good reason. A stone that would require hundreds of workers to drag overland could be loaded onto a barge and floated downstream with relatively little effort. The Egyptians, as we've already seen, made extensive use of the Nile for transporting stone, and they were not alone. The builders of Stonehenge, in what is now southern England, transported the enormous sarsen stones that make up the outer ring of the monument from quarries in the Marlborough Downs, some 25 miles to the north. The exact route they followed is still debated, but many archaeologists believe that at least part of the journey was accomplished by water, using rafts or barges on the rivers and waterways that crisscrossed the Neolithic landscape. Even more remarkable is the transportation of Stonehenge's famous blue stones, the smaller but still substantial stones that form the inner circle of the monument. These stones, each weighing between 2 and 5 tons, did not come from anywhere nearby. They came from the Preseli Hills in southwestern Wales, a distance of approximately 240 kilometres as the crow flies. How Neolithic people, living 4,000 to 5,000 years ago, transported these stones across such an enormous distance remains one of the great unsolved puzzles of prehistoric archaeology. Some researchers have proposed that the stones were moved entirely by human power, dragged on sledges and carried on rafts along a combination of land and sea routes. Others have suggested that the stones were carried to southern England by glaciers during the last ice age, and that the builders of Stonehenge simply found them scattered across the landscape and gathered them up. The debate continues, and it is one that we will explore in much greater depth as we continue our journey tonight. For now, what matters is this. The transportation of stone in the ancient world was not a problem that had a single solution. Every culture, every building project, every landscape demanded its own approach, and the ancient builders were endlessly inventive in devising methods that were suited to their specific circumstances. They used sledges and rollers, barges and rafts, ramps and causeways, levers and counterweights. They harnessed the power of gravity, using downhill slopes to their advantage whenever possible. They harnessed the power of water, using rivers and canals as natural highways. And above all, they harnessed the power of human cooperation, the ability of hundreds or thousands of people to work together, pulling on the same rope, pushing against the same stone, united by a common purpose and a shared vision of something greater than any one of them could achieve alone. It is this human element, this extraordinary capacity for organised cooperative effort, that lies at the heart of every ancient structure we will examine tonight. The pyramids of Egypt were not built by aliens. They were not built by a lost advanced civilization. They were not built by any supernatural force. They were built by people, ordinary people, with ordinary bodies and extraordinary minds, who figured out through patient observation, careful experimentation, and relentless ingenuity how to move mountains. And they did it with nothing but their hands, their ropes, and their will. The greatest ancient structures. Let us begin where all stories of ancient construction must begin, in Egypt, on the Giza plateau, in the shadow of the most famous buildings ever constructed by human hands. The Great Pyramid of Khufu, known in ancient times as Akhet Khufu, the horizon of Khufu, was built approximately 4,500 years ago, during the 4th dynasty of the Old Kingdom of Egypt. It was, for nearly 4,000 years, the tallest structure on Earth, standing at an original height of approximately 146 metres, the equivalent of a modern 48-storey skyscraper. It is composed of roughly 2.3 million blocks of stone, with an average weight of approximately 2.5 tons each, though some of the largest blocks, particularly the granite beams used in the internal chambers, weigh as much as 80 tons. Its base covers an area of more than 13 acres, large enough to contain the cathedrals of Florence, Milan, and St. Peter's in Rome, with room to spare. And it is aligned to the cardinal points of the compass, north, south, east, and west, with an accuracy that deviates from true north by less than 3/60ths of a degree. These are numbers that are difficult to fully comprehend, so let us try to understand them in more human terms. Imagine for a moment that you have been tasked with building the Great Pyramid. You have no electricity, no steel, no internal combustion engines, no cranes, no computers. You have copper tools, stone tools, wooden tools. You have ropes made of papyrus and animal hide. You have sledges and rollers. You have the Nile River. And you have people, thousands of people, organised into work gangs, each with its own foreman, each answering to a hierarchy of overseers and administrators that stretches all the way up to the pharaoh himself. Your first task is to prepare the site. The Giza Plateau is a natural limestone formation, and its surface is uneven, rocky, undulating, dotted with outcrops and depressions. Before a single block can be laid, the entire base area of the pyramid must be levelled to near perfect flatness. The ancient Egyptians accomplished this, most likely, by digging a network of shallow channels across the base area, filling them with water, and then using the water's surface as a level reference, marking the surrounding rock at the waterline and then cutting away everything above it. The result was a base platform that was level to within approximately 2.1 centimetres across its entire 230-metre width, an accuracy that would be considered exceptional even by modern surveying standards. Next comes the quarrying. The bulk stone for the pyramid's core came from quarries located on the plateau itself, just a short distance south of the construction site. Archaeologists have found the remains of these quarries, and they tell a fascinating story. The quarry faces show the marks of thousands of copper chisels, and the floors are littered with the debris of extraction. Stone chips, broken tools, the fossilized traces of the wooden wedges used to split blocks free from the bedrock. The scale of the operation was staggering. Modern estimates suggest that at the peak of construction, the quarries were producing and delivering between 300 and 400 blocks per day, a rate that required extraordinary coordination between the quarrying teams, the transportation teams, and the construction teams working on the pyramid itself. The blocks were moved from the quarry to the pyramid using a combination of sledges and prepared trackways. Archaeological evidence suggests that the Egyptians constructed formal causeways, raised roads with compacted surfaces, along which the sledges could be dragged more efficiently. Water was poured ahead of the sledges to lubricate the surface, as we discussed earlier, and teams of workers hauled on ropes to pull them forward. The distance from the quarry to the pyramid was short, in some cases no more than a few hundred meters, but the sheer volume of material being moved meant that the transportation system had to operate with the efficiency of a modern industrial conveyor belt. Once the blocks arrived at the base of the pyramid, they had to be raised to the correct level. And this is where we encounter the most debated question in all of Egyptian archaeology. How did the Egyptians lift millions of stone blocks to the upper levels of the pyramid? The most widely accepted theory is that they used ramps. A ramp is simply an inclined surface that allows heavy objects to be raised gradually, rather than lifted vertically. The same principle that makes it easier to push a heavy box up a slope than to lift it straight up. But the question of exactly what kind of ramp was used at Giza has generated decades of scholarly debate, and no single answer has achieved universal consensus. The simplest possibility is a single straight ramp, built against one face of the pyramid and extended upward as the structure grew. This is the most intuitive solution, and it would certainly have worked for the lower courses. But there is a fundamental problem with a straight ramp. As the pyramid grows taller, the ramp must grow longer in order to maintain a manageable gradient. By the time the pyramid reached its full height of 146 meters, a straight ramp with a workable slope of about 10% would have to be approximately 1.6 kilometers long and would itself contain nearly as much material as the pyramid. This seems impractical, though not impossible. A more elegant solution, and one that has gained considerable support among Egyptologists in recent years, is the internal ramp theory, proposed by French architect Jean-Pierre Houdin. Houdin suggests that the lower portion of the pyramid, up to about a third of its final height, was built using a conventional external ramp. But for the upper two-thirds, the builders switched to an internal ramp, a spiralling passage built into the body of the pyramid itself, just inside the outer surface. Blocks would be hauled up this internal ramp on sledges, emerging at each corner of the pyramid where they could be turned and redirected up the next segment. The beauty of this theory is that the internal ramp would have required virtually no additional material. It was part of the pyramid itself, and it would have remained functional all the way to the summit. Houdin has pointed to various pieces of evidence in support of his theory, including microgravity surveys of the Great Pyramid that appear to show the existence of a spiral structure within the body of the monument. Other theories include the use of a wraparound ramp that spiraled around the outside of the pyramid, clinging to its faces like a corkscrew, and the use of a series of small temporary ramps positioned at various points around the structure. Each theory has its strengths and its weaknesses, and it is entirely possible that the Egyptians used a combination of methods, one type of ramp for the lower courses, another for the middle, and yet another for the summit. What is not in dispute is the extraordinary precision with which the blocks were placed. The outer casing stones of the Great Pyramid, the smooth white limestone from Tura, were fitted together with joints that average less than 0.5 millimeter in width. To achieve this level of precision, the builders must have used some form of trial fitting, carefully shaping each block to match the ones already in place before setting it permanently. The amount of time and skill this required is staggering to contemplate. Each casing stone had to be cut to shape in the quarry, transported across the Nile, hauled to the pyramid, lifted to the correct level, positioned against its neighbours, and then its surfaces had to be ground and polished until the joint was so fine that the stone appeared to be a single, continuous surface. The interior of the pyramid is no less impressive. The king's chamber, located deep within the heart of the structure, is a masterpiece of granite construction. Its walls are composed of enormous blocks of red granite from Aswan, dressed to a smooth finish and fitted together with remarkable precision. Above the king's chamber are 5 relieving chambers, each roofed with massive granite beams, designed to distribute the colossal weight of the pyramid above and prevent it from crushing the burial chamber below. These relieving chambers represent a sophisticated understanding of structural engineering. The builders understood that the weight of a pyramid is not distributed evenly, and they designed the internal architecture to channel the forces away from the vulnerable spaces within. The Grand Gallery, which leads up to the King's Chamber, is another marvel. It is a soaring corbelled hall, approximately 47 metres long and 8.5 metres high, with walls that step inward as they rise, each course of stone projecting slightly beyond the one below until they nearly meet at the top. The corbelled design distributes the weight of the stone above across the entire length of the gallery, preventing any single point from bearing too much load. It is a solution of breathtaking elegance, and it has kept the Grand Gallery intact for more than 4,500 years. Now let us journey far to the north and west, across the Mediterranean Sea and the English Channel, to a gently rolling landscape of chalk downlands where another ancient monument stands in solitary grandeur against the sky. Stonehenge is perhaps the most recognisable prehistoric monument on Earth. Its great circle of standing stones, capped by horizontal lintels, has been a source of wonder and speculation since at least the 12th century, when Geoffrey of Monmouth attributed its construction to the wizard Merlin. The truth is, as always, both more mundane and more extraordinary than any legend. Stonehenge was not built all at once. It evolved over a period of approximately 1,500 years, from roughly 3000 BCE to around 1500 BCE, through several distinct phases of construction. The earliest phase consisted of a circular earthwork, a ditch and bank enclosure approximately 110 metres in diameter, with a ring of 56 pits, now known as Aubrey holes, dug around its inner edge. These pits may have held wooden posts or small standing stones, and some of them contain cremated human remains, suggesting that the site served as a place of burial and ceremony long before the great stones were erected. The monument we recognise today, the great circle of sarsen stones with their lintels and the inner horseshoe of smaller blue stones, was constructed in a later phase, beginning around 2500 BCE. The sarsen stones are enormous. The largest of them, the heel stone, weighs approximately 35 tons, while the main uprights of the outer circle weigh around 25 tons each. The lintels that sit atop them, connecting one upright to the next in a continuous ring, weigh approximately 7 tons each. They were quarried from the Marlborough Downs, approximately 25 miles to the north, and transported to the site, almost certainly by human power, dragged on sledges along a carefully prepared route. Raising these enormous stones was a feat of engineering that has been the subject of much experimentation and debate. The most widely accepted theory is that the builders dug a hole for each stone, with one side sloped to form a ramp. The stone was then tipped into the hole, its base sliding down the ramp until it dropped into the pit. The stone would now be leaning at an angle, and teams of workers would use ropes to haul it upright, possibly with the aid of an A-frame structure or a large timber lever. Once the stone was vertical, the hole would be packed with rubble and smaller stones to hold it firmly in place. Raising the lintels was even more challenging. Each lintel had to be lifted to the top of the uprights, a height of approximately 4 meters, and then positioned precisely so that the mortise and tenon joints carved into their undersides locked onto the corresponding tenons carved into the tops of the uprights. The most commonly proposed method is a timber crib, a structure built from interlocking layers of logs, like a giant set of Lincoln logs, upon which the lintel could be gradually raised. Workers would lever one end of the lintel up, place logs beneath it, then lever the other end up and add more logs, alternating sides until the lintel reached the required height. It was a slow and painstaking process, but it was well within the technological capabilities of Neolithic people. What makes Stonehenge truly extraordinary, however, is not its size, impressive as that is, but its astronomical precision. The monument is oriented so that the main axis aligns with the direction of sunrise on the summer solstice and sunset on the winter solstice. This was not an accident. The builders of Stonehenge understood the movements of the sun across the sky with sufficient precision to orient their monument to within a fraction of a degree of these key astronomical events. The monument, in other words, was not just a building. It was a calendar and observatory, a place where the passage of time could be marked and celebrated with a solemnity that spanned generations. The blue stones that form the inner circle of Stonehenge present yet another mystery. As we touched upon earlier, these stones, each weighing between 2 and 5 tons, came from the Preseli Hills in southwestern Wales, a journey of approximately 240 kilometres. The question of how they were transported has generated passionate debate. The overland route would have required dragging the stones across rugged terrain, over rivers, and through dense forest. A coastal route, involving rafting the stones along the Welsh coast, up the Bristol Channel, and then along rivers to the Salisbury Plain, would have been shorter, but no less challenging. Recent archaeological discoveries at sites along both potential routes have provided tantalising clues but no definitive answers. What we do know is that the effort involved was enormous and that it was undertaken deliberately. The Preseli bluestones are not ordinary rock. They are spotted dolerite, a type of igneous stone with distinctive blue-grey colouring and white spots, and the people of Neolithic Britain clearly attach special significance to them. Some researchers have suggested that the stones were believed to have healing properties, or that they were associated with a sacred landscape in Wales that the builders wished to transplant to the Salisbury Plain. Whatever the reason, the transportation of the bluestones is one of the most remarkable feats of prehistoric logistics ever recorded, and it speaks to the depth of meaning that these ancient people invested in their monuments. Let us now turn our eyes toward the Andes, toward the high, thin air and the mist-wrapped peaks of Peru, where a city of stone sits in the clouds like something from a dream. Machu Picchu was built in the mid-15th century by the Inca Emperor Pachacuti, perched on a narrow ridge approximately 2,430 meters above sea level, between 2 mountain peaks in the eastern Andes. It is a place of extraordinary beauty and extraordinary engineering, a city that seems to grow out of the mountain itself, its terraces and temples and stairways cascading down the slopes in a harmony of stone and sky that takes the breath away. The construction of Machu Picchu presented challenges that would have been daunting even for modern engineers. The site is remote, accessible only by narrow mountain paths. The terrain is steep and unstable, prone to landslides and heavy rainfall. The altitude is punishing, the air thin and cold and the weather unpredictable. And yet the Inca builders not only constructed a city here, they constructed a city that has endured for more than 5 centuries with remarkably little damage, surviving earthquakes, tropical storms, and the slow, relentless encroachment of the jungle. The secret to Machu Picchu's longevity lies primarily in what you cannot see. Beneath the visible stone structures lies an elaborate drainage and foundation system that represents perhaps the most impressive aspect of Inca engineering at the site. Approximately 60% of the construction effort at Machu Picchu went into the underground infrastructure. The foundations, the drainage channels, the layers of gravel and sand that lie beneath every terrace and building. The Inca engineers understood that the greatest threat to any structure built on a steep rain-drenched mountainside is water. Water seeping into the foundations can cause the soil to become saturated and unstable, leading to landslides and structural collapse. To prevent this, they designed a comprehensive drainage system that channels rainwater away from the buildings and off the mountain through a network of stone-lined channels and drains, many of which are still functioning today, more than 500 years after they were built. The stonework at Machu Picchu is superb. The Inca were masters of a technique known as ashlar masonry, cutting stones into regular rectangular blocks and fitting them together without mortar. The precision of this work varies throughout the site. In the most important buildings, such as the Temple of the Sun and the Intihuatana Shrine, the stones are fitted together with extraordinary tightness, the joints so fine that they are nearly invisible. In less important structures such as storage buildings and workers' quarters, the masonry is coarser, with smaller stones used to fill the gaps between larger blocks. This variation was not the result of carelessness. It was a deliberate expression of hierarchy. The quality of the stonework communicated the importance of each building within the social and religious order of the Inca world. The Inca did not use the wheel for transportation, and they had no draft animals capable of hauling heavy loads. Everything at Machu Picchu, every stone, every timber, every tool, was carried to the site by human hands, up steep mountain paths that wound through dense cloud forest. The organisation required to supply a construction site in such a remote location was formidable. The Inca employed a labour system known as mita, a form of obligatory public service that required every citizen of the empire to contribute a certain amount of labour each year to state projects. This system provided the Inca with an enormous organised workforce that could be deployed wherever it was needed, and at Machu Picchu it was needed in the thousands. The stones themselves were quarried from deposits of granite located on the mountainside near the construction site. The Inca quarrymen used a combination of natural fracture planes and control techniques to extract the blocks. They would identify natural weaknesses in the rock, joints, faults, bedding planes, and exploit them, hammering bronze and stone tools into cracks to widen them, and using wooden wedges and water to split the stone along predetermined lines. The blocks were then shaped by patient hammering with handheld stones, each face ground smooth by abrasion until it fitted perfectly against its neighbours. No two stones at Machu Picchu are exactly the same shape. Each one was individually cut to fit a specific position in the wall, like pieces of a three-dimensional puzzle. The earthquake resistance of Inca masonry is legendary. Peru sits on the Pacific Ring of Fire, one of the most seismically active regions on Earth, and earthquakes are a frequent and devastating occurrence. Many colonial and modern buildings in the region have been destroyed by earthquakes, but Inca walls, including those at Machu Picchu, have repeatedly survived seismic events that levelled everything around them. The reason is their dry stone construction. Because the stones are not bonded by mortar, they are free to move slightly during an earthquake, absorbing the seismic energy by shifting and resettling rather than resisting it rigidly and fracturing. The builders also used a technique of cutting the stones with slightly inward sloping faces so that gravity keeps them pressed together even as they vibrate. It is a design philosophy that modern earthquake engineers describe as plastic response, the ability of a structure to deform without breaking, and the Inca developed it centuries before anyone put a name to it. Now let us descend from the misty heights of the Andes and travel across the Atlantic, back to the ancient world of the Mediterranean, where another kind of engineering genius was at work. The Colosseum of Rome, known in its own time as the Flavian Amphitheatre, is the largest amphitheatre ever built and one of the most iconic structures of the Roman world. Commissioned by the Emperor Vespasian around 70 CE and completed by his son Titus approximately a decade later, it could seat between 50,000 and 80,000 spectators and hosted gladiatorial contests, wild animal hunts, mock naval battles, public executions, and dramatic performances for over 4 centuries. The Colosseum is an oval structure, approximately 189 metres long, 156 metres wide and 48 metres high, with a complex internal arrangement of tunnels, chambers, elevators, and trapdoors that allowed animals, scenery and gladiators to appear and disappear from the arena floor as if by magic. It was built primarily from travertine limestone, volcanic tufa, and brick-faced concrete, the latter being one of Rome's greatest contributions to the history of construction. Roman concrete, opus cementicium, was a revolutionary building material that allowed the Romans to construct structures of a size and complexity that had never been possible before. It was made by mixing volcanic ash, known as pozzolana, with lime and seawater, creating a chemical reaction that produced a material of extraordinary strength and durability. Unlike modern Portland cement concrete, which relies on a purely chemical bond between its components, Roman concrete actually becomes stronger over time as the volcanic ash continues to react with the lime and seawater in a slow, ongoing process of crystallization. This is why Roman concrete structures, including the Colosseum, have survived for nearly 2,000 years, while many modern concrete buildings show significant deterioration after just a few decades. The construction of the Colosseum was a logistical marvel. The travertine limestone for the outer walls was quarried at Tivoli, approximately 35 kilometers east of Rome, and transported to the city on specially constructed roads. An estimated 100,000 cubic meters of travertine was used in the construction, enough to fill approximately 40 Olympic swimming pools. The stones were held together not with mortar, but with iron clamps set in lead, a technique that was both strong and flexible, allowing the structure to absorb minor seismic shocks without cracking. The interior of the Colosseum was constructed using a system of arches and vaults, another Roman engineering specialty. The arch is one of the most efficient structural forms known to engineering, by directing the weight of the material above it outward and downward through its curved shape. An arch can span a much greater distance than a flat lintel, while using less material. The Romans did not invent the arch. The Etruscans and the Mesopotamians had used arches before them, but they perfected it, developing a system of construction that allowed them to build arches quickly, reliably, and in enormous numbers. The Colosseum contains 80 arches on each of its 3 levels, for a total of 240 arched openings in its exterior wall alone, plus hundreds more in the interior corridors and passages. The hypogeum, the underground level beneath the arena floor, was perhaps the most ingenious aspect of the Colosseum's design. Added by the Emperor Domitian after the Colosseum's initial completion, the Hypogeum was a complex maze of tunnels, rooms, and mechanical systems that served as the backstage area for the spectacles above. It contained animal cages, gladiator staging areas, and an elaborate system of hoists and elevators powered by counterweights and human muscle. These elevators could lift scenery, props, and even large animals through trapdoors in the arena floor, creating dramatic surprise entrances that thrilled the audience. The largest of these elevators could raise loads weighing several tons, and they were operated with remarkable speed and precision, a testament to the Romans' mastery of mechanical engineering. The velarium, the enormous retractable awning that could be unfurled to shade the spectators from the sun, was another engineering triumph. It consisted of a series of canvas panels supported by a network of ropes and masts that could be extended from the top of the outer wall to cover a significant portion of the seating area. The rigging was operated by sailors from the Roman Navy, stationed at a nearby barrack specifically for this purpose, because the skills required to manage the massive canvas panels in varying wind conditions were essentially the same as those required to manage the sails of a warship. The Colosseum was not just a building, it was a machine, a vast, complex, precisely calibrated machine designed to create experiences of spectacle and wonder on a scale that the ancient world had never before imagined. Let us continue our journey now, travelling east across the Indian Ocean to the dense tropical forests of Southeast Asia, where another monument of almost unimaginable scale rises from the jungle canopy. Angkor Wat, located in present-day Cambodia, is the largest religious monument ever constructed. Built in the first half of the 12th century by the Khmer king Suryavarman II, it was originally dedicated to the Hindu god Vishnu before being gradually converted to a Buddhist temple in the late 12th and early 13th centuries. The temple complex covers an area of approximately 162.6 hectares, more than 400 acres, and its central tower rises to a height of 65 metres above the surrounding plain. The construction of Angkor Wat required the quarrying, transportation, and placement of between 5 and 10 million blocks of sandstone, with a total weight estimated at more than 5 million tons. The sandstone was quarried from the Kulin Hills, approximately 40 kilometres to the northeast, and transported to the construction site via a network of canals and waterways that the Khmer had constructed over the preceding centuries. The Khmer hydraulic engineering system, which supplied water for irrigation, transportation, and urban use across the vast Angkor metropolitan area, was one of the most sophisticated water management systems in the ancient world. It included enormous artificial reservoirs, known as barays, some measuring as much as 8 kilometres long and 2 kilometres wide, connected by a network of canals, channels and waterways that extended across hundreds of square kilometres. This system served multiple purposes. It provided water for rice agriculture, which supported a population estimated at nearly 1 million people. It controlled flooding during the monsoon season, and it provided a transportation network for the movement of heavy building materials. The sandstone blocks for Angkor Wat were loaded onto rafts or barges at the quarry site and floated down the canals to the construction site, a journey that, depending on the water level and the season, could take anywhere from a few days to several weeks. At the construction site, the blocks were unloaded and hauled into position using a combination of earth ramps, wooden scaffolding, and human muscle. No mortar was used in the construction of the temple walls. Instead, the blocks were held in place by their own weight and by the precision of their fitting, supplemented in some areas by iron dowels. The decoration of Angkor Wat is one of its most extraordinary features. The exterior walls of the temple are covered with nearly 2,000 square meters of bas-relief carvings depicting scenes from Hindu mythology, historical events, and the daily life of the Khmer court. The most famous of these reliefs, located in the outer gallery, depicts the churning of the ocean of milk, a Hindu creation myth in which the gods and demons cooperate to churn the primordial ocean, producing the elixir of immortality. The relief stretches for approximately 49 meters and contains hundreds of individual figures, each carved with meticulous attention to detail. The muscles of the gods straining against the cosmic serpent, the waves of the ocean churning with fish and sea creatures, the apsaras, celestial dancers, floating in the clouds above. The carving of these reliefs was an enormous undertaking in itself. The sandstone blocks were first set into the walls in their rough state, and then the carving was done in situ, the sculptors working from scaffolding, chiselling the intricate designs directly into the surfaces of the assembled wall. The consistency and quality of the carving across the entire temple suggests that the work was carried out by large teams of highly trained artisans, working under the direction of master sculptors who maintained a unified artistic vision throughout the decades-long construction process. The central tower of Angkor Wat is oriented so that it is aligned with the spring equinox, the day when the sun rises directly over the top of the central tower when viewed from the western entrance. This astronomical alignment, like the solstice alignment at Stonehenge, was clearly deliberate, and it reflects the Khmer understanding of cosmology. The temple was conceived as a microcosm of the universe, with a central tower representing Mount Meru, the mythical home of the gods in Hindu tradition. And now let us turn our attention to the longest structure ever built by human hands, a wall that stretches across mountains and deserts, over rivers and through valleys, for thousands upon thousands of kilometers, from the shores of the Pacific Ocean to the edge of the Gobi Desert. The Great Wall of China is not a single wall. It is a vast, sprawling network of walls, watchtowers, beacon towers, barracks, and fortifications that was constructed, reconstructed, and expanded over a period of more than 2,000 years, from the 7th century BCE to the 17th century CE. The total length of all known sections of wall, including branches, spurs, and secondary lines, is estimated at approximately 21,196 kilometers, a distance roughly equivalent to half the circumference of the Earth. The earliest walls were built by individual Chinese states during the Warring States period, 475 to 221 BCE, as defences against raids by nomadic peoples from the northern steppes. When the first emperor of China, Qin Shi Huang, unified the country in 221 BCE, he ordered that the existing walls be connected and extended into a single, continuous fortification stretching across the entire northern frontier. This work was carried out by hundreds of thousands of labourers, soldiers, peasants, and convicts, working under brutal conditions and at tremendous cost in human life. Ancient Chinese historical texts record that many thousands of workers died during the construction, their bodies buried within the wall itself, a grim foundation for one of humanity's greatest engineering achievements. The construction methods used for the Great Wall varied enormously, depending on the period of construction, the terrain, and the materials available locally. In the western deserts, where stone was scarce, the early walls were built using rammed earth, a technique in which layers of moist earth are packed into wooden forms and compacted by pounding with heavy tools, creating a dense, hard, remarkably durable material that, in the dry desert climate, can last for centuries. Remnants of these earliest rammed earth walls still survive in parts of Gansu and Ningxia provinces, their weathered surfaces bearing the marks of tools used more than 2,000 years ago. In the mountains of northern China, where stone was abundant, The wall was constructed from locally quarried rock, cut into rough blocks and stacked without mortar. In the flat plains and river valleys, where neither stone nor firm earth was readily available, the builders used a variety of expedient materials, bundles of reeds and branches, layers of gravel and sand, even bundles of tamarisk twigs, anything that could be compacted and shaped into a defensible barrier. The most impressive and best preserved sections of the Great Wall are those built during the Ming Dynasty, 1368 to 1644 CE, when the wall was extensively renovated and rebuilt using brick and stone. The Ming Wall is a masterpiece of military engineering, typically 6 to 7 meters high and 4 to 5 meters wide at the top, wide enough for 5 horses to ride abreast, with watchtowers spaced at regular intervals of approximately 500 meters. The watchtowers served multiple purposes. They provided elevated observation posts from which sentries could spot approaching enemies. They housed small garrisons of soldiers, and they served as relay stations in a sophisticated signalling system that used smoke signals by day and fire signals by night to transmit warnings of attack along the length of the wall at remarkable speed. A message could travel from one end of the Ming Wall to the other in approximately 24 hours, faster than any messenger could ride. The construction of the Ming Wall required an enormous investment of labour and materials. The bricks were manufactured at kilns located near the construction sites, using locally sourced clay and a standardised production process that ensured consistency across the thousands of kilometres of wall. Each brick was stamped with the name of the kiln and the supervisor responsible for its production, a quality control measure that allowed defective bricks to be traced back to their source and the responsible parties to be held accountable. The mortar used to bind the bricks was, in many sections, made from a mixture of lime and sticky rice flour, a material that modern chemical analysis has shown to be remarkably strong and durable, with adhesive properties that in some cases surpass those of modern cement. The human cost of the Great Wall's construction is incalculable. Over the centuries, millions of labourers, soldiers, convicts, conscripted peasants, worked on the wall, often under conditions of extreme hardship. In the mountain sections, workers had to haul heavy loads of stone and brick up steep, narrow paths, often at altitudes where the air was thin and the cold was brutal. In the desert sections, workers endured scorching heat, sandstorms, and chronic shortages of water and food. Deaths from exhaustion, disease, accidents, and exposure were common, and the Great Wall's reputation as the longest cemetery on Earth is, sadly, well earned. But for all its human cost, the Great Wall remains one of the most extraordinary achievements in the history of construction. It is a testament to the organisational power of the Chinese state, the skill of Chinese engineers and builders, and the endurance of the millions of ordinary people who, across more than 2,000 years, transformed a vast and hostile landscape into one of the most recognisable structures on Earth, engineering challenges and solutions. Having walked among these greatest of ancient structures, let us now step back and consider more deeply the specific engineering challenges that their builders faced, and the remarkable solutions they devised. The first and most fundamental challenge was always the same: gravity. Every stone, every brick, every timber beam has weight, and that weight must be supported by something beneath it. In the simplest structures, a single-storey dwelling, a low garden wall, this is not a significant concern. The ground itself provides a stable foundation, and the weight of the structure is easily borne. But as structures grow taller, heavier, and more complex, the management of gravitational forces becomes a matter of survival. A structure that cannot effectively distribute its weight will settle unevenly, crack, buckle, and ultimately collapse. The ancient builders understood this problem intimately, even if they lack the formal language of modern structural engineering to describe it. They understood it through experience, through generations of building, observing, failing, and building again. They understood it through intuition, a craftsman's sense, developed over years of practice, for what felt right and what felt wrong. And they expressed their understanding not in equations and diagrams, but in stone and mortar, in the shapes and proportions of the buildings themselves. The arch is perhaps the most important structural innovation of the ancient world. As we touched upon when discussing the Colosseum, an arch works by redirecting vertical forces, the weight of the structure above, into horizontal forces that are channeled outward and downward through the curved shape of the arch and into the supporting piers on either side. This allows an arch to span a much greater distance than a flat lintel, while supporting a much greater weight. The Romans were the supreme masters of arch construction, but the principle was understood and employed by civilizations across the ancient world, from Mesopotamia to Mesoamerica. The vault is an extension of the arch principle into 3 dimensions, essentially a continuous arch that creates a curved ceiling or roof. The simplest vault is the barrel vault, which is formed by extending an arch along a straight line, creating a tunnel-shaped space. By intersecting 2 barrel vaults at right angles, the Romans created the groin vault, a more complex form that allowed them to roof large open spaces with elegant soaring ceilings supported on relatively slender columns. The groin vaults of the great Roman baths, such as the baths of Caracalla and the baths of Diocletian, spanned distances of more than 20 metres and rose to heights of more than 30 metres, achievements that would not be surpassed until the construction of the great Gothic cathedrals 1,000 years later. The dome is the most spectacular expression of the arch principle. A dome is essentially an arch rotated around its vertical axis, creating a hemispherical or semi-hemispherical shell that can roof a circular or polygonal space of immense size. The greatest dome of the ancient world, and one of the greatest engineering achievements of any age, is the Dome of the Pantheon in Rome. The Pantheon was built by the Emperor Hadrian between approximately 118 and 128 CE, replacing an earlier temple on the same site. Its dome spans 43.3 metres in diameter, a measurement that was not exceeded until the construction of the Florence Cathedral dome by Brunelleschi in the 15th century, more than 1,300 years later. The dome is constructed from unreinforced Roman concrete, poured in a continuous process over a temporary wooden centering, a framework of timber that supported the wet concrete until it had hardened and could support itself. The concrete mix was carefully varied throughout the dome's construction. Heavier aggregates such as travertine and tufa were used at the base, where the dome needs to be strongest, while lighter aggregates such as pumice were used near the top, where reducing weight was critical. The interior of the dome is coffered, divided into a grid of recessed panels that both reduce the weight of the dome and create a dramatic visual effect, as the coffers diminish in size as they approach the oculus at the summit. The oculus, a circular opening 8.2 metres in diameter at the very top of the dome, is the building's only source of natural light. It serves both a structural and an aesthetic purpose. Structurally, it eliminates the need for a heavy keystone at the dome's apex, reducing the overall weight. Aesthetically, it creates a shaft of sunlight that moves slowly across the interior throughout the day, illuminating the coffered ceiling with a warm golden glow that changes from hour to hour and season to season. The Pantheon's dome has survived for nearly 1,900 years without significant damage, a testament to the extraordinary quality of Roman concrete and the profound engineering skill of its designers. Modern structural analysis has shown that the dome operates very close to its theoretical limits. The concrete is under compression throughout, with only minimal tensile stresses occurring at certain points near the base of the dome. The fact that the Roman engineers managed to design a structure that so closely approaches the optimal form is remarkable, and suggests a level of mathematical and structural understanding that was not formally articulated until centuries later. Another critical engineering challenge was earthquake resistance. As we noted when discussing Machu Picchu, many ancient civilizations built in seismically active regions, and the survival of their structures depended on their ability to withstand the violent shaking of the earth. Different cultures developed different solutions to this problem, but several common principles can be identified. The first is flexibility, a structure that can flex and deform during an earthquake, absorbing the seismic energy through controlled movement rather than resisting it rigidly, is far more likely to survive than one that is stiff and brittle. The Inca achieved this through their dry stone masonry, which allows individual blocks to shift and resettle during an earthquake. The Japanese achieved it through their timber frame construction, which uses interlocking joints rather than rigid fasteners, allowing the frame to sway and flex during an earthquake without breaking. The famous 5-story pagoda at Horyuji in Nara, Japan, built in the early 7th century CE, has survived more than 1,300 years of earthquakes, in part because its central column, which runs from the base to the top of the structure, is not rigidly attached to the surrounding floors but hangs freely, acting as a kind of pendulum that counteracts the swaying of the building during seismic events. This principle, known as a tuned mass damper, was not formally described by modern engineers until the 20th century. The Japanese builders of Horyuji apparently understood it intuitively, more than a millennium earlier. The second principle is mass distribution. Ancient builders in earthquake-prone regions learned, through bitter experience, that top-heavy structures are more vulnerable to earthquake damage than structures that taper as they rise. This is why ancient stepped pyramids and pyramidal temples are found throughout the earthquake zones of the world, in Mesoamerica, in Southeast Asia, in Java, in ancient Mesopotamia. The pyramidal form, with its broad base and narrow summit, concentrates the structure's mass low to the ground, lowering its center of gravity and reducing the swaying motion that causes earthquake damage. The great Mesoamerican pyramids at Teotihuacan, at Tikal, at Chichen Itza are essentially earthquake-proof by design, their massive stepped profiles distributing seismic forces across their enormous bases. The third principle is foundation preparation. A structure is only as stable as the ground it stands on, and ancient builders went to extraordinary lengths to ensure that their foundations were solid and secure. The Inca, as we have seen, devoted 60% of their construction effort at Machu Picchu to underground infrastructure. The Romans routinely drove timber piles into marshy or unstable ground before laying foundations, a technique that was also used extensively in ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia. In Japan, the builders of castle keep sometimes used a technique called banchiku, in which alternating layers of stone and gravel were packed into foundation trenches, creating a composite base that was both strong and flexible, able to bear enormous weight while absorbing seismic vibrations. Water management was another critical challenge. Ancient structures were threatened not only by earthquakes, but also by water, rain, groundwater, flooding, erosion. A building that cannot effectively shed water will eventually be undermined and destroyed, no matter how strong its walls may be. The solutions that ancient builders devised for water management were often as impressive as the structures themselves. The Maya, for example, built elaborate reservoir and cistern systems at their cities, collecting rainwater from plastered surfaces and channeling it through stone-lined channels into underground storage chambers. At the great Maya city of Tikal in present-day Guatemala, an extensive system of reservoirs collected and stored millions of litres of water, supporting a population of tens of thousands in a region where surface water was scarce. The reservoirs were lined with a mixture of clay and lime plaster that rendered them waterproof, a technology that, while simple in concept, required considerable skill and knowledge to execute successfully. The Romans were perhaps the greatest hydraulic engineers of the ancient world. Their aqueduct systems, which transported water over distances of up to 100 kilometres using nothing but gravity, are justly famous. But their drainage systems were equally impressive. The Cloaca Maxima, the great sewer of Rome, was originally constructed in the 6th century BCE to drain the marshy lowland that would later become the Roman Forum. Over the centuries it was enlarged, extended and incorporated into an increasingly sophisticated urban drainage network that served the city for more than 1,000 years. Parts of the original Cloaca Maxima are still in use today, a testament to the durability of Roman engineering and the far-sightedness of its designers. Tools, techniques and lost knowledge. The tools used by ancient builders were, by modern standards, remarkably simple. But simplicity should not be confused with inefficiency. A tool is only as limited as the understanding of the person who wields it, and the ancient builders wielded their tools with a mastery born of lifelong practice and generational knowledge. The most basic tool in the ancient builder's kit was the stone hammer, a heavy, dense rock, shaped to fit comfortably in the hand, used for rough shaping and quarrying. Stone hammers have been found at construction sites and quarries throughout the ancient world, from the dolerite pounders of the Egyptian granite quarries to the basalt hammerstones used by the builders of Göbekli Tepe, the 12,000-year-old temple complex in southeastern Turkey that is the oldest known monumental structure on Earth. Copper and bronze tools represented a significant advance. Copper chisels, capable of cutting limestone and softer stones, were in widespread use in Egypt by the early 3rd millennium BCE and remained the standard quarrying tool throughout the pyramid building age. Bronze, which is harder and holds an edge better than copper, gradually replaced pure copper tools during the 2nd millennium BCE. Bronze chisels, adze, saws and drills have been found at construction sites across the ancient world, and their marks can still be seen on the surfaces of quarried stone and shaped timber. Iron tools, when they became available, represented another quantum leap in capability. Iron is significantly harder than bronze, and can be sharpened to a finer edge, making it vastly more effective for cutting, chipping and carving stone. The widespread adoption of iron tools during the 1st millennium BCE enabled builders to work harder stones more quickly and with greater precision, opening up new possibilities in architectural design and decoration. The exquisitely detailed carvings on Greek temples, the intricate relief sculptures of the Assyrian palaces, the delicate stonework of the late Roman period, all of these were made possible, in part, by the availability of iron tools. But some of the most impressive ancient construction work was accomplished not with metal tools at all, but with abrasion, the slow, patient process of grinding stone against stone until the desired shape is achieved. The Inca, who did not have iron tools, shaped their enormous stone blocks using handheld hammerstones of extremely hard rock, such as quartzite or diorite, pounding the surface of the softer andesite or granite blocks until they achieved the precise fit required. This was painstaking work. Shaping a single large block could take weeks or even months, but the results were extraordinary. The precision of Inca stonemasonry, achieved entirely through abrasion and patience, remains unsurpassed by any other culture in history. One of the most sophisticated tools in the ancient builder's arsenal was not a physical tool at all, but a conceptual one: mathematics. The ancient Egyptians possessed a working knowledge of geometry that, while not formalized in the way that Greek geometry later would be, was sufficient to allow them to design and construct buildings of extraordinary precision. The Rin mathematical papyrus and the Mosca mathematical papyrus, both dating from the Middle Kingdom period, roughly 2000 to 1700 BCE, contain mathematical problems and solutions that relate directly to the practical needs of construction, calculating the slope of a pyramid's face, determining the volume of a truncated pyramid, computing the area of a circle. These were not abstract exercises. They were the working tools of architects and surveyors, used every day on the construction sites of ancient Egypt. The Greeks took mathematical understanding to another level entirely. Euclid's Elements, written around 300 BCE, formalized the principles of geometry that had been accumulated over centuries of practical experience, creating a system of mathematical reasoning that is still the foundation of geometry today. But even before Euclid, Greek architects were applying mathematical principles to their buildings with breathtaking sophistication. The Parthenon, built between 447 and 432 BCE, under the direction of the architects Ictinus and Callicrates and the sculptor Phidias, is a masterpiece of mathematical refinement. Every line in the building that appears to be straight is actually slightly curved. The columns lean inward by approximately 7 centimeters over their 4-meter height. The stylobate, the platform on which the columns stand, rises approximately 6 centimeters at its center, creating a subtle convexity that counteracts the optical illusion of sagging that a perfectly flat surface would create when viewed from a distance. These refinements, known as entasis, were calculated with extraordinary precision and required enormous skill to execute. Every column, every block of the stylobate, every entablature beam had to be individually shaped to conform to the overall curvature of the design. Surveying instruments were another critical technology. The ability to measure distances, angles, and elevations accurately was essential for every aspect of ancient construction, from laying out the plan of a building to aligning it with celestial events. The Egyptian builders used a device called a merket, essentially a plumb line combined with a sighting instrument, to establish true north and to align their buildings with the cardinal directions. The accuracy they achieved was extraordinary. The Great Pyramid is aligned to true north with an error of less than 3/60th of a degree, an accuracy that would require sophisticated surveying techniques to achieve even today. The Roman surveying instrument par excellence was the groma, a cross-shaped device mounted on a vertical pole, with plumb lines hanging from each of the 4 arms. By sighting along the plumb lines, a Roman surveyor could establish precise right angles and straight lines across any terrain, no matter how rough or uneven. The groma was used to lay out the plans of everything from individual buildings to entire cities, and its accuracy is attested by the remarkable straightness of Roman roads and the precise orthogonal grid plans of Roman military camps and colonial towns. The Corobus was a more sophisticated Roman surveying tool, essentially a large spirit level, a long flat wooden beam with a groove cut into its upper surface which could be filled with water to establish a true horizontal plane. The Corobus was used primarily in the construction of aqueducts, where maintaining a consistent, precise gradient over long distances was absolutely critical. The gradient of a typical Roman aqueduct is extraordinarily slight, often less than 1 meter of drop per kilometer of length, and maintaining this gradient across rough, hilly terrain required surveying of the highest possible accuracy. Transportation technology was another area where ancient ingenuity produced remarkable results. We have already discussed sledges, rollers, and barges, but the ancient world also made use of more specialized devices. The Romans, for example, used a wheeled vehicle called a plaustrum for transporting heavy loads overland, and they developed a system of paved roads, the famous Roman road network, that allowed these vehicles to move efficiently over long distances. For particularly heavy loads, such as obelisks and monumental columns, the Romans sometimes used specially constructed wheeled cradles, fitted with multiple axles and pulled by teams of oxen. One of the most ingenious transportation methods ever devised was used by the ancient Egyptians to move the colossal statues known as the Colossi of Memnon from their quarry to their final position. These statues, each standing approximately 18 meters tall and weighing approximately 720 tons, were carved from single blocks of quartzite sandstone quarried at Gebel el Ahmar, near modern Cairo, and transported approximately 675 kilometers upstream along the Nile to their current location at Thebes. The transportation was accomplished during the annual flood season, when the Nile inundated a vast area of the floodplain, creating a broad, shallow lake that allowed heavily loaded barges to navigate far inland from the normal river channel. The barges used for this purpose must have been enormous, specialized vessels capable of bearing loads of more than 700 tons while maintaining stability in shallow, potentially turbulent floodwaters. No examples of these barges have survived, but contemporary descriptions and later Roman accounts suggest that they were among the largest watercraft built in the ancient world. Lifting technology was critical for any structure that rose above a single story. The most common lifting device in the ancient world was the lever, one of the 6 classical simple machines identified by ancient Greek scientists. A lever is simply a rigid bar that pivots on a fixed point, the fulcrum, allowing a small force applied over a large distance at one end to produce a large force over a small distance at the other end. With a sufficiently long lever and a well-placed fulcrum, a single person can lift a weight many times greater than they could move by hand alone. The ancient builders used levers extensively, both for positioning individual stones during construction and for raising heavy objects from one level to another. The crane is a more sophisticated lifting device, and its invention is traditionally attributed to the ancient Greeks of the 6th century BCE. The earliest cranes were simple affairs, a single vertical mast with a pivoting boom, equipped with a rope and pulley for lifting loads. Over time, Greek and Roman engineers developed increasingly complex crane designs, incorporating compound pulleys, systems of multiple pulleys that further multiply the mechanical advantage, treadwheel drives, large wooden wheels similar to hamster wheels, inside which human operators walk to provide the driving force, and swiveling booms that could rotate to position a load precisely. The largest Roman cranes were capable of lifting loads of several tons to heights of 30 meters or more than sufficient for the construction of most Roman buildings. The compound pulley, or block and tackle, was one of the most important lifting technologies of the ancient world. By threading a single rope through a series of pulleys, alternating between fixed pulleys attached to the crane structure and movable pulleys attached to the load, the effective force required to lift the load could be reduced by a factor equal to the number of rope segments supporting the load. A block and tackle with 4 supporting rope segments, for example, reduces the force required to lift a load to 1/4 of the load's weight, meaning that a team of workers exerting a combined force of, say, 500 kilograms could lift a 2-ton stone block. Archimedes is credited with having demonstrated the principle of the compound pulley and with having designed some of the most powerful lifting devices of the ancient world, though the extent of his specific contributions remains debated. The human element behind every ancient structure, behind every stone and every timber, every mortar joint and every carved relief, there were people. And not abstract anonymous masses of nameless labourers, but real, individual human beings with families and hopes and fears and aching backs and calloused hands. The story of ancient construction is, at its most fundamental level, the story of these people. The architects who imagined the impossible, the engineers who figured out how to make it possible, the skilled craftsmen who shaped stone and carved wood with breathtaking artistry, and the vast armies of ordinary workers who provided the muscle that turned imagination into reality. For centuries, the popular imagination held that the great monuments of the ancient world were built by slaves, whipped and starving wretches driven to their deaths by cruel overseers in the service of tyrannical kings. This image, powerfully reinforced by Hollywood films and biblical narratives, is largely inaccurate, at least for many of the most famous structures. The labourers who built the pyramids of Giza, for example, were not slaves. This is not a matter of speculation or wishful thinking. It is the conclusion of decades of careful archaeological research. In the 1990s, the Egyptian archaeologist Zahi Hawass and his colleague Mark Lehner excavated a vast workers' settlement located just south of the Giza Plateau. What they found was a well-organised community of several thousand people, with dormitories, bakeries, breweries, fish processing facilities, medical clinics, and even a cemetery. The graves in the cemetery contained the remains of workers who had been buried with simple but respectful care. Their bodies laid out in the traditional Egyptian manner, their graves marked with small limestone headstones, some of them inscribed with the names and titles of the deceased. This was not how slaves were treated in the ancient world. These were respected workers who were given proper burials, evidence that they held a recognised and valued place in Egyptian society. Analysis of the skeletal remains has provided further insights into the lives of these workers. Many of the bones show evidence of healed fractures, degenerative joint disease, and other conditions consistent with years of hard physical labour, but they also show evidence of medical treatment. Bones that had been broken were set and splintered. Teeth that had decayed were extracted. Workers who had suffered serious injuries appear to have been given time to recover before returning to work. These were not the bodies of people who were worked to death and discarded. They were the bodies of people who were worked hard but cared for, fed, housed, treated when injured, and mourned when they died. The workers were organised into gangs, each with its own name, its own identity, and apparently its own sense of pride. Graffiti found within the pyramid itself, marks made by the construction crews on the blocks they placed, reveals the names of some of these gangs: Friends of Khufu, Drunkards of Menkaure, Pure Ones of Khufu. These are not the names that would be chosen by slaves. They are the names of proud, competitive work teams, groups of men who took satisfaction in their work and identified themselves with the great project they were helping to build. The workers appear to have been drawn from communities across Egypt, recruited as part of a system of corvée labour, a form of taxation in which citizens owed a certain amount of labour to the state each year, similar to the Incomitar system. Many of them were farmers, called up to work on the pyramid during the annual flood season, when their fields were underwater and agricultural work was impossible. For these seasonal workers, service on the pyramid was not just a duty but an opportunity, a chance to serve the divine pharaoh, to participate in a project of cosmic significance, and to receive regular meals, medical care, and other provisions that may well have exceeded what was available to them in their home villages. At the top of the organisational hierarchy were the architects and engineers, the men who designed the pyramids and oversaw their construction. We know surprisingly little about these individuals, but a few names have survived. Hemiunu, a nephew of the pharaoh Khufu, is traditionally credited as the architect of the Great Pyramid. A limestone statue of Hemiunu, now in the Römer und Pelisäus Museum in Hildesheim, Germany, depicts a heavy-set, dignified man with a calm, confident expression, the look of a person who knows his own worth. Hemiunu held the title of Overseer of all construction projects of the king, a title that suggests he was not merely an architect but an administrator, of enormous scope and authority, responsible for coordinating every aspect of the pyramid's construction. The quarrying, the transportation, the placement of blocks, the management of the workforce, the supply of food and water, the procurement of tools and materials. The skills of these ancient architects were not acquired in universities or through formal training programs. They were learned through apprenticeship, through years of working alongside experienced builders, absorbing knowledge that had been accumulated over generations. In Egypt, this knowledge was guarded by the scribal class, the literate elite who maintained the mathematical and technical records upon which all construction depended. The ability to read, write, and calculate was the key to advancement in the construction hierarchy, and the master builders who designed and directed Egypt's greatest monuments were, without exception, members of this elite class. In other civilizations, the relationship between social status and construction expertise took different forms, but the pattern of specialized knowledge passed down through generations of practitioners was remarkably consistent. In ancient Greece, architects were highly respected professionals who moved from city to city, taking on commissions from wealthy patrons and civic governments. The most famous Greek architects, Ictinus and Callicrates, who designed the Parthenon, Hermogenes, who developed the principles of Ionic temple design, Pythios, who designed the mausoleum at Halicarnassus, were celebrated figures, admired for their learning, their artistic vision, and their technical skill. In Rome, the architect Vitruvius, writing in the 1st century BCE, described the ideal architect as a person of broad education and diverse talents. An architect, Vitruvius wrote, should be skilled in drawing, geometry, history, philosophy, music, medicine, law, and astronomy. A vision of the architect as a kind of universal intellect, capable of bringing together knowledge from every field of human inquiry and applying it to the practical challenges of building. Whether any real Roman architect lived up to this extraordinary ideal is debatable, but the fact that Vitruvius articulated it tells us something important about how the ancient world viewed the profession of architecture, not as a narrow technical specialty, but as one of the highest expressions of human intelligence and creativity. Below the architects in the construction hierarchy were the skilled craftsmen, the stonemasons, carpenters, metalworkers, painters, and sculptors who transformed raw materials into finished building components. These were the people who did the truly difficult work of shaping stone to precise dimensions, carving intricate decorative details, fitting timber frames, and applying plaster and paint. Their skill was the product of years of training, and their work was judged by exacting standards. In medieval Japan, the master carpenters known as miyadaiku were revered for their ability to construct complex timber structures using nothing but interlocking joints. No nails, no screws, no metal fasteners of any kind. The joints they devised, with names like sugite, splicing joints, and shiguchi, connecting joints, were works of engineering genius, designed to distribute forces efficiently while allowing the timber frame to flex during earthquakes. A master miyadaiku could look at a piece of timber and know from the pattern of its grain how it would behave under stress, where it would be strongest, where it was likely to split, how it would shrink or swell with changes in humidity. This knowledge, accumulated over centuries, was passed down within family guilds and was considered a sacred trust. The labour force that supported these skilled workers was vast. Building a monumental structure required not just quarrymen, masons and carpenters, but also a small army of support workers, cooks, bakers, brewers, potters, weavers, tool makers, rope makers, water carriers, and countless others. The construction site of a major ancient project was essentially a self-contained community. a town within a town, with its own economy, its own social hierarchy and its own daily rhythms. Feeding this community was an enormous logistical challenge. The workers who built the pyramids consumed, by modern estimates, approximately 11 cattle and 33 sheep or goats per day, plus vast quantities of bread, beer, onions, garlic and other staples. The bakeries and breweries excavated at the Giza workers' settlement were industrial in scale, capable of producing enough food and drink to sustain a workforce of several thousand. Theories versus evidence. Throughout the centuries, the extraordinary achievements of ancient builders have inspired not only admiration but also disbelief. How could people without modern technology have accomplished such seemingly impossible feats? The question is understandable, but the answers that have sometimes been offered, invoking alien intervention, lost advanced civilizations or supernatural forces, say more about our own biases than about the actual capabilities of the ancient world. The ancient aliens hypothesis, popularized by writers such as Erich von Däniken and by television programs, claims that many ancient structures were built with the assistance of extraterrestrial beings who visited Earth in prehistoric times. Proponents of this theory point to various features of ancient construction that they consider beyond the capabilities of the civilizations that built them. The precise alignment of the pyramids, the enormous weight of the stones at Baalbek, the geometric perfection of Stonehenge, the supposed resemblance of certain ancient carvings to modern aircraft or spacecraft. The problems with the ancient aliens hypothesis are numerous and fundamental. First, every feature of ancient construction that has been cited as evidence of alien intervention has been plausibly explained by archaeologists and engineers using known ancient techniques. The alignment of the pyramids can be achieved using the merket and other simple surveying instruments. The movement of enormous stones can be accomplished using sledges, rollers, levers, and organized human labor. The mathematical precision of ancient buildings can be explained by the mathematical knowledge that we know ancient civilizations possessed, as documented in their own written records. Second, the ancient aliens hypothesis rests on a deeply condescending assumption about the capabilities of ancient peoples, particularly non-European peoples. It is notable that the aliens built it explanation is most frequently invoked for structures built by African, Asian and indigenous American civilizations, while the achievements of ancient Greece and Rome are more readily attributed to human genius. This pattern reflects not a dispassionate assessment of the evidence, but a cultural bias, an unconscious assumption that certain peoples are inherently incapable of extraordinary achievement. This assumption is not only factually wrong, it is morally offensive. Third, and most fundamentally, the ancient aliens hypothesis is unnecessary. There is no feature of any ancient structure that requires an explanation beyond the known capabilities of the civilization that built it. Ancient peoples were not primitive, fumbling savages who needed extraterrestrial assistance to build a wall or raise a stone. They were intelligent, resourceful, creative human beings who developed sophisticated solutions to complex engineering problems through patient observation, careful experimentation, and generations of accumulated knowledge. To attribute their achievements to aliens is not a compliment, it is an insult. A more nuanced but equally problematic theory is the lost advanced civilization hypothesis, which suggests that structures such as the Sphinx, the pyramids, and various megalithic monuments around the world were built by a technologically advanced civilization that existed before the last ice age, and was destroyed by a global catastrophe approximately 12,000 years ago. Proponents of this theory, such as Graham Hancock, point to what they consider anomalous features of certain ancient structures, unusual geological weathering patterns on the Sphinx, alleged underwater structures off the coast of Japan, and claimed astronomical alignments that supposedly date certain monuments to periods far earlier than mainstream archaeology suggests. The lost civilization hypothesis has a certain romantic appeal, and some of the questions it raises are legitimate. The geological weathering of the Great Sphinx, for example, has been the subject of genuine scientific debate. The geologist Robert Schoch has argued that the pattern of erosion on the Sphinx's body is consistent with prolonged exposure to rainfall rather than wind-blown sand, which would suggest that the Sphinx was carved at a time when the Egyptian climate was significantly wetter than it was during the Old Kingdom, possibly as early as 5000 BCE or earlier. This theory has been vigorously debated among geologists and Egyptologists, with no definitive consensus. However, the broader lost civilization hypothesis faces the same fundamental problem as the ancient aliens theory. There is no archaeological evidence for the existence of an advanced pre-Ice Age civilization. No tools, no buildings, no written records, no artifacts of any kind have been found that would support the existence of such a civilization. The geological and archaeological record of the last 20,000 years has been extensively studied, and while it contains many surprises and mysteries, it does not contain the kind of evidence, widespread technological artifacts, large-scale construction remains, evidence of metallurgy or advanced manufacturing, that would be expected if an advanced civilization had existed and then been destroyed. What the evidence does support, overwhelmingly and consistently, is the conclusion that the great structures of the ancient world were built by the civilizations that archaeologists have identified and studied. The Egyptians, the Maya, the Inca, the Khmer, the Romans, the Greeks, and the many other cultures that developed the skills and knowledge needed to accomplish these extraordinary feats. The story of how they did it is not less remarkable for being true. If anything, it is more remarkable, because it demonstrates what human beings are truly capable of when they combine intelligence, determination, organisation and patience in the service of a shared vision. The truth is that we do not need aliens or lost civilizations to explain the wonders of the ancient world. We need only look at the evidence, the quarries, the tool marks, the construction ramps, the workers' settlements, the mathematical papyri, the architectural treatises, and at the human beings who left that evidence behind. They were people very much like us, no smarter, no stronger, no more magical, but they were willing to devote years of their lives, and sometimes their lives themselves, to building something that would outlast them. And in that willingness, in that quiet, stubborn refusal to be defeated by the sheer impossibility of what they were attempting, lies the true miracle of ancient construction. And there is so much more to this story. So many other structures, so many other builders, so many other feats of engineering genius that deserve to be remembered and marvelled at. The great monuments we have already explored are only the beginning. The ancient world was filled with structures that challenge our understanding and expand our appreciation of what human beings can accomplish, and each one has its own story to tell. Consider, for example, the temple complex at Göbekli Tepe in southeastern Turkey, a site that has fundamentally transformed our understanding of the origins of monumental construction. Göbekli Tepe was built approximately 12,000 years ago during the pre-pottery Neolithic period by hunter-gatherers who had not yet developed agriculture, pottery, or metalworking. This is, to put it mildly, astonishing. Before Göbekli Tepe was discovered, the prevailing assumption in archaeology was that monumental construction was a product of settled agricultural societies, that people had to develop farming, create food surpluses, and organise themselves into complex social hierarchies before they could attempt anything as ambitious as building a temple. Göbekli Tepe turned this assumption on its head. The site consists of a series of circular enclosures, each defined by massive T-shaped limestone pillars, some of them standing more than 5 meters tall and weighing up to 15 tons. The pillars are decorated with carved reliefs depicting animals: lions, foxes, scorpions, vultures, boars, and abstract symbols whose meaning remains uncertain. The enclosures were not dwellings. There is no evidence of permanent habitation at the site. They appear to have been gathering places, possibly ceremonial or religious in nature, where groups of hunter-gatherers came together for reasons that we can only guess at. The construction of Göbekli Tepe required a level of organisation and cooperation that was previously thought to be beyond the capabilities of pre-agricultural societies. Quarrying, transporting and erecting 15-ton limestone pillars with nothing but stone tools required coordinated labour. Dozens or perhaps hundreds of people working together over extended periods of time. It required planning. Someone had to design the enclosures, determine where each pillar would be placed, and coordinate the sequence of construction. And it required motivation. Something had to inspire these Neolithic hunter-gatherers to invest enormous amounts of time and effort in building structures that served no practical survival-related purpose. The German archaeologist Klaus Schmidt, who led the excavation of Göbekli Tepe from its discovery in 1994 until his death in 2014, proposed a radical hypothesis that it was the desire to build monuments like Göbekli Tepe that drove the development of agriculture, not the other way around. Schmidt argued that the need to feed the large labour force required for monumental construction may have been one of the factors that pushed Neolithic communities to transition from foraging to farming, growing crops in order to produce the food surplus needed to support builders. If Schmidt was right, then the entire trajectory of human civilization may owe something to the very human impulse to build something magnificent and enduring. From the world's oldest known temple, let us travel to one of its most mysterious, the ancient city of Baalbek in present-day Lebanon. Baalbek is known primarily for its Roman-era Temple of Jupiter, one of the largest and most ornate temples ever built by the Roman Empire. But beneath the Roman temple lie the remains of an earlier structure, a massive stone platform composed of some of the largest cut stones in the world. The most famous of these stones are the 3 blocks known as the Trilithon, 3 enormous limestone blocks, each measuring approximately 19 metres long, 4 metres high, and 3 metres wide, and weighing approximately 800 tons each. They are set into the western retaining wall of the temple platform, at a height of approximately 7 metres above ground level, and they are fitted together with joints so fine that they are barely visible. The precision with which these colossal blocks were cut, transported and placed is nothing short of extraordinary. But the Trilithon stones are not even the largest at Baalbek. In a nearby quarry, still partially attached to the bedrock, lies the stone of the pregnant woman, a single block of limestone estimated to weigh approximately 1,000 tons. And adjacent to it, discovered in 2014, lies an even larger block, estimated to weigh approximately 1,650 tons, the largest known stone block ever quarried by human hands in the ancient world. How were these colossal blocks moved? The quarry is located approximately 900 metres from the temple platform, and the terrain between them, while relatively flat, is not perfectly level. Moving an 800-ton stone 900 metres without modern machinery would be an extraordinary undertaking. The most likely method, based on archaeological evidence, is a combination of wooden rollers, sledges, and organised human labour. Essentially the same techniques used elsewhere in the ancient world, but scaled up to an almost unimaginable degree. Some researchers have estimated that moving a single trilithon block would have required the coordinated effort of at least 40,000 men working in shifts, pulling on ropes while the block was guided forward on a prepared trackway. Others have suggested that the stones may have been moved on wooden sledges, lubricated with oil or animal fat, requiring somewhat fewer workers, but still a truly enormous labour force. The question of who built the original platform at Baalbek and when remains a subject of debate. Some researchers attribute it to the Romans, while others argue that the platform predates the Roman temple and was built by an earlier civilization, possibly the Phoenicians or even an earlier unidentified culture. The stones of the trilithon are significantly larger than anything else the Romans are known to have moved, which has led some researchers to question whether they truly had the capability to quarry and transport them. However, the Romans were demonstrably capable of extraordinary engineering feats, and the trilithon stones, while exceptionally large, are not fundamentally different in kind from the many other massive stones that the Romans are known to have moved at other sites throughout their empire. Let us shift our gaze now to the ancient Near East, to the land between the rivers, Mesopotamia, where some of the earliest monumental structures in human history were built. The ziggurats of Mesopotamia were massive stepped pyramids built from sun-dried mud bricks that served as the ceremonial centres of Sumerian, Babylonian and Assyrian cities. The most famous of them, the Great Ziggurat of Ur, built by the Sumerian king Ur-Nammu around 2100 BCE, originally stood approximately 30 metres tall and measured 64 metres long by 46 metres wide at its base. It was a solid mass of mud brick, with a mud brick facing and a core of rubble and packed earth, crowned by a small temple at its summit that served as the dwelling place of the city's patron deity. The construction of the ziggurats presented challenges quite different from those faced by the builders of stone monuments. Mud brick is a relatively weak material, far less durable than stone and highly vulnerable to erosion by rain and wind. To compensate for these weaknesses, the Mesopotamian builders developed several ingenious techniques. First, they built on an enormous scale, creating structures so massive that the inevitable erosion of their outer surfaces would take centuries or millennia to threaten their structural integrity. Second, they incorporated layers of bitumen, a naturally occurring asphalt, between the courses of bricks, creating waterproof barriers that slowed the penetration of moisture into the interior of the structure. Third, they built drainage systems into the walls themselves, embedding reed mats and woven channels in the brickwork to allow moisture that did penetrate the outer surface to evaporate before it could soften the interior. The mud bricks used in ziggurat construction were manufactured on an industrial scale. Each brick was made by mixing river mud with straw, which served as a binding agent and reduced cracking during drying, pressing the mixture into wooden moulds, and then leaving the bricks to dry in the sun for several weeks. The number of bricks required for a single ziggurat was staggering. Modern estimates suggest that the Great Ziggurat of Ur contained approximately 720,000 baked bricks in its outer facing alone, with millions more sun-dried bricks in its interior. Manufacturing, transporting and laying this many bricks was a massive logistical operation that required careful planning and coordination. The concept of the ziggurat eventually gave rise to one of the most legendary structures of the ancient world, the Tower of Babel. The biblical account of the Tower of Babel, a great tower built in the plain of Shinar, Mesopotamia, by a united humanity speaking a single language, which God destroyed by confusing the builders' languages, is generally believed to be inspired by a real structure, the Etemenanki, a colossal ziggurat dedicated to the god Marduk that stood in the heart of ancient Babylon. The Etemenanki was rebuilt multiple times over the centuries, and in its final form, constructed by King Nebuchadnezzar II in the 6th century BCE, it may have stood as tall as 91 metres, the height of a modern 30-storey building. It was, by any measure, one of the most ambitious structures of the ancient world, and its destruction, probably during the Persian conquest of Babylon, or the subsequent centuries of neglect, was a loss that reverberates to this day. Now let us journey to the Indian subcontinent, where another tradition of monumental construction flourished for thousands of years. The rock-cut temples of India are among the most extraordinary achievements in the history of architecture. Buildings that were not constructed from quarried blocks, but carved directly out of living rock, sculpted from the mountainside itself. The process of creating a rock-cut temple is essentially the reverse of conventional construction. Instead of assembling a building from individual components, the builders removed everything that was not the building, carving away the surrounding rock to reveal the temple within. The most spectacular example of rock-cut architecture in India, and arguably in the world, is the Kailasa temple at Ellora in the state of Maharashtra. Built during the reign of the Rashtrakuta king Krishna I in the 8th century CE, the Kailasa temple is dedicated to the Hindu god Shiva and is designed to represent Mount Kailasa, Shiva's mythical home in the Himalayas. It is an enormous structure, approximately 60 metres long, 33 metres wide and 30 metres tall, and every square centimetre of it was carved from a single outcrop of basalt rock. The construction of the Kailasa temple began at the top and worked downward. Workers first cut a series of enormous trenches into the rock cliff, removing approximately 200,000 tons of stone to create a freestanding block of rock approximately the size of a small mountain. They then sculpted this block from the top down, carving out the temple's elaborate towers, pillared halls, sculptures, and decorative details with extraordinary precision and artistry. The temple is covered with intricate carvings depicting scenes from Hindu mythology. Gods, demons, elephants, lions, mythical creatures, and the quality of the carving is superb, with delicate details that seem almost impossible to achieve in hard basalt rock. The logistics of the Kailasa temple's construction are mind-boggling. Working from the top down meant that the builders had to plan the entire structure in advance. Every room, every pillar, every decorative detail had to be designed before the first chisel struck stone, because a mistake made at the top could not be corrected later, without redoing an enormous amount of work. The removal of 200,000 tons of rock, equivalent to roughly 80,000 cubic meters, was accomplished entirely by hand, using iron chisels and hammers. Modern estimates suggest that the carving of the temple took approximately 18 to 20 years, assuming a workforce of several thousand skilled stonecutters working continuously. The rock-cut temples of Petra, in present-day Jordan, represent another magnificent tradition of carved architecture. Petra was the capital of the Nabatean kingdom, a prosperous trading civilization that flourished from the 4th century BCE to the 1st century CE. The city is famous for its elaborate facades, carved directly into the rose-red sandstone cliffs of a narrow canyon known as the Sikh. The most famous of these facades, the Treasury, or Al-Khazne, is a towering structure approximately 40 metres tall and 25 metres wide, carved with a level of detail and artistic sophistication that has astonished visitors for centuries. The Nabatean builders of Petra, like the Indian builders of Ellora, worked from the top down, carving the upper portions of their facades first and then working their way to the ground. This top-down approach allowed them to use the gradually lowering work surface as a natural scaffolding platform, eliminating the need for freestanding scaffold structures. The technique required extraordinary skill and planning. The proportions and details of the facade had to be maintained consistently as the carving progressed downward, and any errors in the upper portions would be impossible to correct once the lower portions had been carved. Let us continue our exploration by turning to the ancient civilizations of Mesoamerica, where another tradition of monumental construction produced structures of breathtaking scale and complexity. The pyramid temples of the Maya, the Aztecs, and the earlier civilizations that preceded them are among the most impressive architectural achievements of the pre-Columbian Americas. The The largest of them, the Great Pyramid of Cholula, in present-day Mexico, is, by volume, the largest pyramid in the world, exceeding even the Great Pyramid of Giza. It covers an area of approximately 450 meters on each side, and rises to a height of approximately 55 meters, though its form is now largely obscured by centuries of accumulated soil and vegetation, topped by a colonial-era Catholic church. The Pyramid of Cholula was not built all at once, but grew through a series of construction phases spanning approximately 1,000 years, from roughly 300 BCE to 700 CE. Each phase involved building a new, larger pyramid over the existing structure, a technique known as superimposition that was common throughout Mesoamerica. The earlier pyramids were not demolished, they were simply buried under layers of earth and rubble, and the new pyramid was built on top of them. This process of repeated superimposition created the enormous volume of the finished structure, which contains approximately 4.45 million cubic meters of material. The construction techniques used by Mesoamerican builders varied depending on the available materials and the specific cultural traditions of each civilization. The Maya, who built extensively in the limestone-rich lowlands of the Yucatan Peninsula, quarried and shaped limestone blocks for the outer surfaces of their pyramids, filling the interiors with rubble and packed earth. The Aztecs, who built in the volcanic highlands of central Mexico, used a combination of volcanic stone and adobe, sun-dried mud bricks. All Mesoamerican civilizations made extensive use of lime plaster, a material produced by burning limestone at high temperatures and then mixing the resulting calcium oxide with water, which was applied as a smooth, durable coating over the stone or adobe surfaces of their buildings. In many cases, the plaster was painted with vivid colours: red, blue, yellow, green, transforming the temples into brilliant, eye-catching monuments that blazed with colour against the tropical sky. The city of Teotihuacan, located approximately 50 kilometers northeast of modern Mexico City, represents perhaps the most ambitious urban planning project in the pre-Columbian Americas. At its peak, around 450 CE, Teotihuacan was one of the largest cities in the world, with a population estimated at between 100,000 and 200,000 people. The city was laid out on a precise grid plan, centered on a broad ceremonial avenue known today as the Avenue of the Dead, which stretches for approximately 2.5 kilometers and is lined with dozens of pyramid temples, platforms, and residential compounds. The two largest structures at Teotihuacan, the Pyramid of the Sun and the Pyramid of the Moon, are massive constructions that required the movement and placement of millions of tons of material. The Pyramid of the Sun, the larger of the two, measures approximately 225 meters on each side at its base, and originally rose to a height of approximately 75 meters. It was constructed in a single massive building campaign, probably lasting several decades, and its core is composed of approximately 1.2 million cubic meters of earth, rubble, and adobe, a volume comparable to that of the Great Pyramid of Giza. One of the most remarkable aspects of Teotihuacan's construction is the evidence of urban planning and standardized construction techniques. The city's buildings were constructed using a consistent modular system, with rooms and courtyards built to standardized dimensions and proportions. The streets and avenues were laid out on a regular grid that was oriented approximately 15 degrees east of true north, an alignment that has been interpreted as having astronomical significance, possibly related to the position of the setting sun on certain calendar dates. The consistency of the city's design suggests a powerful centralized authority capable of planning and directing construction on an enormous scale, though the identity of the rulers of Teotihuacan remains one of the great mysteries of Mesoamerican archaeology, as the city's inhabitants left no known written records. let us now travel across the Pacific to the scattered islands of Polynesia, where some of the most enigmatic stone structures in the world stand watch over the vast ocean. The moai of Easter Island, the enormous stone statues that line the island's coastline, their elongated faces gazing solemnly inland, are among the most recognisable archaeological monuments on Earth. There are approximately 900 moai on the island, carved from volcanic tuff quarried at the Rano Raraku volcano crater. The statues range in height from approximately 1 metre to more than 10 metres, with the largest unfinished moai measuring over 20 metres long and weighing approximately 82 tonnes. They were carved using basalt handpicks, and the production rate was impressive. Archaeologists estimate that a team of about 6 carvers could produce a finished moai in approximately 12 to 18 months. The great mystery of the moai is not how they were carved. That process is well understood, but how they were transported from the quarry to their final positions around the island's perimeter, a distance that in some cases exceeded 10 kilometres over rough hilly terrain. Multiple theories have been proposed, and the debate has been long and sometimes heated. Some researchers have suggested that the moai were transported on wooden sledges or rollers, dragged along prepared trackways by large teams of workers. Others have proposed that they were moved on wooden cradles, rocked from side to side in a walking motion. Still others have suggested that they were transported in an upright position, walked forward by teams of workers using ropes to tilt the statue from side to side, causing it to pivot on its base and inch forward like a wobbling refrigerator being moved across a kitchen floor. This last theory, the walking moai hypothesis, has gained considerable support in recent years, bolstered by experimental evidence. In 2011, a team of researchers demonstrated that a full-size replica moai could indeed be moved in an upright position by as few as 18 people using ropes at a rate of approximately 100 meters per hour. The technique worked remarkably well on relatively flat terrain, and it aligned with the oral traditions of the Rapa Nui people themselves, who have long maintained that the moai walked to their platforms. From the Pacific, let us return to the Mediterranean world and consider one of the ancient world's greatest but least well-known engineering achievements: the underground cisterns and water systems of the ancient world. The Basilica Cistern of Constantinople, known in Turkish as Yerebatan Sarnıcı, the Sunken Palace, is one of several hundred ancient cisterns that lie beneath the streets of modern Istanbul. Built by the Byzantine Emperor Justinian I in 532 CE, it is an enormous underground chamber, approximately 140 metres long and 65 metres wide, capable of storing approximately 80,000 cubic metres of water. Its ceiling is supported by 336 marble columns, each 9 metres tall, arranged in 12 rows of 28 columns each. The columns were recycled from demolished Roman-era buildings throughout the empire, a common practice in Byzantine construction, and they display a variety of architectural styles and decorative details that reflect their diverse origins. The Basilica Cistern was part of an elaborate water supply system that served the city of Constantinople for more than 1,000 years. Water was brought to the city from forests and reservoirs in Thrace, approximately 20 kilometres to the north, via a network of aqueducts and channels. The most impressive of these was the Valens Aqueduct, a massive stone structure stretching approximately 970 metres across the centre of the city, which carried water from the northern highlands into the city's distribution system. The aqueduct, combined with a vast underground cistern network, gave Constantinople a reliable water supply that sustained its population through centuries of sieges, droughts, and political upheavals. The engineering of the cisterns themselves was a remarkable achievement. Each cistern had to be waterproof, a challenging requirement for an underground structure built from stone and brick. The Byzantine engineers achieved this by lining the interior walls and floor with a thick layer of hydraulic mortar, a cement-like material made from lime, volcanic ash, and crushed brick that sets and hardens even when immersed in water. This material, similar to the Roman opus signinum that was used to waterproof baths, aqueducts and harbours throughout the Roman world, created a durable, impermeable seal that prevented water from seeping out through the walls and floor of the cistern. Many of these cisterns, despite being more than 1,500 years old, still hold water today. Let us consider now the remarkable construction achievements of ancient sub-Saharan Africa, a region whose architectural heritage has been systematically overlooked and undervalued by Western scholarship, but which contains some of the most impressive and enigmatic structures anywhere in the ancient world. The ruins of Great Zimbabwe, located in the southeastern hills of modern Zimbabwe, are the remains of a major city that flourished between the 11th and 15th centuries CE. The city's most impressive feature is a massive stone enclosure known as the Great Enclosure, an elliptical wall approximately 250 metres in circumference, up to 11 metres tall and 5 metres thick, built entirely from locally quarried granite blocks laid without mortar. The wall is constructed using a technique known as dry stone walling, in which carefully shaped stones are fitted together so precisely that the structure is held together by friction and gravity alone. The quality of the stonework at Great Zimbabwe is superb. The courses are level and regular, the faces are smooth, and the overall effect is one of dignified solidity and permanence. The city of Great Zimbabwe was the capital of a prosperous trading kingdom that controlled much of the gold trade between the interior of southern Africa and the coastal ports of the Indian Ocean. At its peak, the city had a population of approximately 18,000 people and covered an area of approximately 700 hectares. The stone structures, including the Great Enclosure, a hilltop fortress known as the Hill Complex, and numerous smaller enclosures scattered across the valley below, were the residences and ceremonial spaces of the ruling elite. The majority of the population lived in more modest dwellings constructed from daga, a mixture of mud and gravel that have not survived. When European explorers first encountered the ruins of Great Zimbabwe in the 19th century, many of them refused to believe that the structures could have been built by the indigenous peoples of the region. Various theories were proposed: that Great Zimbabwe was built by the Phoenicians or the Queen of Sheba or King Solomon or some other external civilization, but every one of these theories was based on racial prejudice rather than evidence. Systematic archaeological excavation carried out from the early 20th century onward has conclusively demonstrated that Great Zimbabwe was built by the Shona people, the ancestors of the modern Shona-speaking population of Zimbabwe, using techniques and materials that were entirely indigenous to the region. The Lalibela churches of Ethiopia represent another extraordinary achievement of African construction. Located in the highlands of northern Ethiopia, the 11 rock-hewn churches of Lalibela were carved directly out of the living rock in the 12th and 13th centuries CE during the reign of the Zagwe dynasty. Like the Kailasa temple at Ellora, the Lalibela churches were created by removing rock rather than assembling it, but the scale and ambition of the project at Lalibela is arguably even more impressive because it involved the creation not of a single temple, but of an entire complex of interconnected churches, tunnels, and ceremonial passages, all carved from the same massive block of volcanic tuff. The most famous of the Lalibela churches, Bete Georgis, the Church of St. George, is carved in the shape of a perfect cross, set in a deep pit approximately 12 metres below ground level. The church measures approximately 12 metres in each direction and rises to a height of approximately 12 metres, with its flat roof level with the surrounding ground surface. Every detail of the church, The doorways, the windows, the interior pillars and arches, the drainage channels, the decorative mouldings, was carved from a single block of stone. The precision and artistry of the work is breathtaking, and the engineering challenges involved, particularly the need to remove thousands of tons of rock from above and around the church without damaging the delicate carved surfaces, were formidable. The construction of the Lalibela churches is attributed in Ethiopian tradition to King Lalibela himself, who is said to have been assisted by angels. The true builders were, of course, human craftsmen, but the scale and quality of their work justify the legend. The Lalibela churches remain in active use as places of Christian worship, and they attract pilgrims from across Ethiopia and around the world. They are a monument to the skill and faith of their builders, and a reminder that the history of monumental construction extends far beyond the civilizations of the Mediterranean and the Near East. The ancient world's mastery of construction extended far beyond temples and pyramids. Some of the most impressive engineering achievements of antiquity were not religious or ceremonial structures at all, but practical works of infrastructure: roads, bridges, harbours, aqueducts, and fortifications that served the daily needs of the ancient communities and enabled the functioning of complex societies. The Roman road network, for example, was one of the most ambitious infrastructure projects ever undertaken by any civilization. At its peak, the Roman road system comprised approximately 400,000 kilometres of paved and unpaved roads, stretching from Britain in the northwest to Mesopotamia in the southeast, from the Rhine and Danube frontiers in the north to the Sahara Desert in the south. The most important of these roads, the great trunk roads that connected Rome to the far reaches of the empire, were paved highways of extraordinary quality, constructed to standards that would not be matched in Europe until the 19th century. The construction of a Roman road followed a standardized procedure that had been refined over centuries. First, surveyors would lay out the route, using the groma and other instruments to establish a straight line across the terrain. Roman roads were famous for their straightness. Many of them ran for miles without a single curve, cutting through hills, bridging valleys, and crossing rivers with an almost stubborn determination to maintain a direct course. This straightness was not merely aesthetic, it was practical. A straight road is shorter than a winding one, and shorter roads mean faster travel times, lower maintenance costs, and more efficient movement of troops and supplies. Once the route was established, workers would excavate a trench approximately 1 metre deep and 4 to 6 metres wide. The bottom of the trench was compacted and in some cases lined with large flat stones to create a stable base. On top of this base, layers of progressively finer material were laid. First, a layer of large stones and rubble, then a layer of smaller stones, gravel and concrete, and finally, a surface layer of tightly fitted stone slabs set in mortar and carefully graded to create a slight crown at the centre of the road. This crown, a convex curve that caused the road surface to slope gently from the centre toward the edges, was a critical feature because it allowed rainwater to drain off the road surface and into ditches dug along both sides, preventing the accumulation of standing water that would soften and damage the road's foundation. The bridges that carried Roman roads across rivers and valleys were engineering masterpieces in their own right. The Romans built thousands of bridges throughout their empire, many of which are still standing and in use today. The Pont de Garde in southern France is perhaps the most famous, a 3-tiered aqueduct bridge that carries a water channel across the Garden River at a height of approximately 49 metres. Built in the 1st century CE entirely from dressed stone blocks, without mortar, the Pont de Garde is a testament to Roman engineering at its most confident and assured. The individual blocks are so precisely cut and fitted that the structure has stood for nearly 2,000 years with minimal maintenance. The the Roman aqueduct system as a whole was one of the greatest engineering achievements of the ancient world. Rome itself was served by 11 major aqueducts, built over a period of approximately 500 years, which together supplied the city with an estimated 1 million cubic meters of fresh water per day, a quantity that modern water engineers have estimated was sufficient to provide every inhabitant of Rome with approximately 600 to 900 litres of water per day, far more than the average modern American consumes. This water supplied not only private homes and public fountains, but also the city's many public baths, the great thermae that were among the most important social institutions of Roman life. The construction of an aqueduct was an enormously complex undertaking that required careful surveying, precise engineering, and years of labour. The gradient of the water channel had to be maintained at a gentle, consistent slope, typically between 1 and 3 metres per kilometre, across whatever terrain the aqueduct happened to cross. This meant building bridges to cross valleys, tunnels to pass through hills, and long stretches of elevated channel, supported on arched structures, to maintain the correct elevation across flat or uneven ground. The surveying accuracy required to maintain a consistent gradient over distances of 50 or 100 kilometres was extraordinary, and the fact that Roman aqueducts functioned reliably for centuries is proof that the Roman surveyors achieved it. Let us now consider the remarkable engineering of ancient harbours and maritime construction, a subject that is less well known than temples and pyramids, but no less impressive. The harbour at Caesarea Maritima, on the Mediterranean coast of present-day Israel, was one of the most ambitious construction projects of the ancient world. Built by King Herod the Great between approximately 22 and 10 BCE, the harbour was designed to be the largest artificial port on the Mediterranean coast, a massive enclosed basin sheltered from the open sea by enormous breakwaters constructed from concrete blocks that were cast and placed underwater. The construction technique used at Caesarea was remarkably sophisticated. The builders fabricated large wooden forms, essentially enormous open-topped boxes, which were towed into position, sunk to the seabed, and then filled with a special concrete mixture made from volcanic ash, imported from Italy, lime, and seawater. This hydraulic concrete set and hardened underwater, creating massive blocks that formed the foundation of the breakwaters. Additional courses of concrete and stone were then laid on top, building the breakwaters up to a height above sea level. The southern breakwater extended approximately 600 metres into the sea, while the northern breakwater extended approximately 250 metres, creating an enclosed harbour basin of approximately 80,000 square metres, large enough to accommodate hundreds of ancient ships. The use of hydraulic concrete for underwater construction was a Roman specialty, and the harbour at Caesarea was one of its most spectacular applications. Modern analysis of Roman hydraulic concrete has revealed that it possesses remarkable properties. It is resistant to erosion by seawater, it becomes stronger over time rather than weaker, and its microstructure is remarkably dense and free of the voids and cracks that plague modern marine concrete. The volcanic ash that was its key ingredient, pozzolana from the Bay of Naples region, reacted with seawater to form a crystalline mineral called aluminous tobermarite, which fills pores and microcracks in the concrete, making it progressively more impervious to water over the centuries. Modern engineers have studied Roman hydraulic concrete extensively, hoping to learn from its remarkable durability and develop more sustainable alternatives to modern Portland cement. Ancient fortification engineering is another field that produced remarkable innovations. The defensive walls of ancient cities were not simply barriers. They were complex, multi-layered defensive systems designed to exploit every possible advantage of terrain, geometry, and military tactics. The Theodosian walls of Constantinople, built in the early 5th century CE, and maintained and expanded for more than 1,000 years, were perhaps the most formidable fortification system ever constructed in the ancient and medieval world. They consisted of 3 parallel lines of defence, an outer moat approximately 18 metres wide and 7 metres deep, a low outer wall approximately 2 metres thick and equipped with towers at regular intervals, and the great inner wall approximately 5 metres thick, 12 metres tall, and defended by 96 massive towers, each standing approximately 20 metres tall. The Theodosian walls were constructed from a combination of limestone blocks and brick courses, bonded with lime mortar. A distinctive feature of their construction was the use of alternating bands of stone and brick, typically 4 or 5 courses of stone alternating with 4 or 5 courses of brick, which gave the walls their characteristic striped appearance and also served a structural purpose. The brick courses, being more flexible than stone, acted as levelling courses that helped distribute loads evenly and accommodated minor settling without cracking. The walls also incorporated a sophisticated internal drainage system, with channels embedded in the masonry to carry away rainwater and prevent the accumulation of moisture that could weaken the mortar joints. For more than 1,000 years, the Theodosian wall successfully defended Constantinople against attack by Persians, Arabs, Avars, Bulgars and Russians. They were finally breached in 1453 during the Ottoman siege of Constantinople, when Sultan Mehmet II deployed massive bombard cannons, a new technology that the walls had not been designed to resist. Even then, the walls held out for 53 days of continuous bombardment before a section was finally breached. The fact that fortifications designed and built in the 5th century CE could resist attack for a millennium and then withstand the most powerful weapons of the 15th century for nearly 2 months is a testament to the extraordinary quality of their design and construction. Let us consider now the sophisticated construction practices of ancient China, where engineering innovation produced structures and systems of astonishing scale and ingenuity. The Grand Canal of China is the longest artificial waterway in the world, stretching approximately 1,776 kilometres from Beijing in the north to Hangzhou in the south. The canal was constructed in stages over a period of more than 2,000 years, with the earlier sections dating from the 5th century BCE and the final connections completed during the Sui dynasty in the 7th century CE. At its peak, the Grand Canal was one of the most important transportation arteries in the world, carrying goods, people and tribute between the rice-growing regions of southern China and the political centres of the north. The construction of the Grand Canal was an engineering project of almost inconceivable scale. It involved the excavation of millions of cubic metres of earth, the construction of hundreds of bridges, the creation of lock systems to manage changes in elevation, and the engineering of flood control systems to protect the canal from the devastating floods that periodically swept through the Chinese river systems. The workforce was enormous. Chinese historical records suggest that the Sui dynasty emperor Yang Guang mobilized more than 5 million workers for the final phase of construction, making it one of the largest labor mobilizations in human history. The lock systems used on the Grand Canal were particularly ingenious. Pound locks, chambers with gates at each end that could be opened and closed to raise or lower the water level, allowing boats to navigate changes in the elevation, were invented in China in the 10th century CE, roughly 5 centuries before they were developed independently in Europe. The earliest Chinese pound locks used simple wooden gates, but later versions incorporated sophisticated mechanisms for controlling water flow and equalizing pressure, allowing boats carrying heavy cargoes to move smoothly between different levels of the canal. Ancient mining and tunnelling represent yet another dimension of construction ingenuity that deserves attention. The ability to tunnel through solid rock, to create underground passages, chambers and shafts, was essential for many ancient construction projects, from the mining of building stone and metals to the creation of underground water channels, tomb complexes and defensive tunnels. The ancient Egyptians were among the first to develop systematic tunnelling techniques. The tomb complexes in the Valley of the Kings, near ancient Thebes, required the excavation of long, deep tunnels into the limestone hillside. These tunnels, some extending more than 200 meters into the rock, were cut using copper and bronze tools, working by the light of oil lamps in conditions of extreme heat and poor ventilation. The workers, organized into shifts that alternated between several days of work and several days of rest, used a simple but effective ventilation system in which fresh air was wafted into the tunnels using large cloth fans positioned at the entrance. The Romans took tunnelling to new levels of ambition and sophistication. The Claudius Tunnel, built in the 1st century CE to drain Lake Fucino in central Italy, was one of the most impressive tunnelling projects of the ancient world. The tunnel stretched approximately 5.6 kilometers through solid limestone, from the lake to a nearby river valley, and required the labour of approximately 30,000 workers over a period of 11 years. The tunnel was excavated from both ends simultaneously, with vertical shafts sunk at intervals along the route to provide ventilation and to allow workers to verify their alignment. When the two working faces met in the middle, they were aligned with remarkable precision, a testament to the accuracy of Roman surveying techniques. One of the most intriguing aspects of ancient construction is the evidence for standardization and quality control. Modern manufacturing relies heavily on standardized components, parts that are manufactured to precise, uniform specifications so that they can be assembled interchangeably. This concept is usually associated with the Industrial Revolution, but the ancient world had its own forms of standardization, developed independently by civilizations that recognized the practical benefits of consistency and uniformity in construction. The Romans were perhaps the most systematic practitioners of construction standardization. Roman bricks, for example, were manufactured in standardized sizes, the most common being the basilis, approximately 20 centimeters square, the sesquipedalis, approximately 44 centimeters square, and the bipedialis, approximately 59 centimeters square. These standard sizes allowed bricks to be manufactured in the large quantities at central kilns and then distributed to construction sites across the empire, where they could be used interchangeably without the need for custom fitting. Each brick was stamped with the name of the manufacturer, the date of production, and sometimes the name of the military unit or government official responsible for ordering it, a quality control measure that allowed defective bricks to be traced to their source. The Inca also practiced a form of standardization in their construction, though it took a different form from the Roman approach. Rather than manufacturing standardized components, the Inca standardized the process of construction itself, developing a set of techniques and procedures that could be applied consistently across the vast extent of their empire. Every Inca building, from the grandest temple to the humblest storehouse, was constructed using the same basic principles of dry stone masonry, the same methods of foundation preparation, and the same approach to drainage and water management. This standardization of practice ensured a consistent level of quality throughout the empire and made it possible for construction teams to be deployed to any location without the need for extensive retraining. The concept of construction as a spiritual or sacred act is another thread that runs through the building traditions of virtually every ancient civilization. For most ancient peoples, the construction of a monumental building was not merely a practical undertaking, but a profoundly religious one, an act of creation that mirrored, in human terms, the divine creation of the world itself. In ancient Egypt, the construction of a temple or pyramid was accompanied by elaborate rituals at every stage of the process. The laying of the foundation was preceded by a ceremony known as stretching the cord, in which the pharaoh and the priests used ropes and stakes to establish the building's alignment with the stars, symbolically connecting the earthly structure to the cosmic order. The placement of the first stone was accompanied by offerings to the gods, and special protective amulets and figurines were buried in the foundations to ward off evil spirits and ensure the building's longevity. In ancient Rome, the inauguration of a new building was preceded by the consultation of augurs, priests who interpreted the will of the gods by observing the flight patterns of birds and other natural signs. If the augurs declared the omens favourable, the building could proceed. If not, it might be delayed, relocated, or even abandoned. The completion of a major building was celebrated with a dedicatory ceremony in which the building was formally consecrated to its patron deity, and offerings of incense, wine, and animal sacrifice were made. In Hindu tradition, the construction of a temple follows the principles laid out in ancient texts known as the Vastu Shastras, treatises on architecture and sacred geometry that prescribe the proper orientation, proportions, and layout of religious buildings. Every aspect of a Hindu temple's design, from the position of the main entrance to the height of the central tower to the dimensions of the inner sanctum, is governed by these texts, which derive their authority from the belief that the temple is a dwelling place of the divine, and that its design must reflect the cosmic order if it is to serve its sacred purpose. The idea that a building can embody cosmic order, that its proportions and orientation can serve as a map of the universe, is one of the most widespread and persistent concepts in the history of architecture. It is found in cultures separated by thousands of miles and thousands of years, from the ziggurats of Mesopotamia to the Gothic cathedrals of medieval Europe, from the stupas of Buddhist Asia to the kivas of the Pueblo peoples of the American Southwest. The specific cosmologies that these buildings express are different, but the underlying impulse is the same: the desire to create, in stone and timber and brick, a structure that connects the human world to the divine, the earthly to the celestial, the finite to the infinite. This spiritual dimension of ancient construction is often overlooked in modern discussions, which tend to focus on the practical and technical aspects of building. But for the people who conceived, designed, and built these structures, the spiritual and the practical were inseparable. A building was not merely a shelter or a monument. It was a statement of belief, a prayer made permanent, a bridge between worlds, and the care and skill that the ancient builders lavished on their structures, the precision of their measurements, the beauty of their carvings, the perfection of their proportions, was not simply a matter of professional pride. It was an act of devotion. Let us also consider the lesser-known but equally fascinating world of ancient underground construction. Throughout the ancient world, civilizations created remarkable underground structures, not just mines and tunnels, but entire underground cities, complete with living quarters, storage rooms, ventilation systems, and defensive features. The underground cities of Cappadocia in central Turkey are perhaps the most spectacular example. The largest of these, Derinkuyu, extends to a depth of approximately 85 meters below the surface and could accommodate as many as 20,000 people, along with their livestock and food supplies. The city consists of multiple levels of interconnected rooms, corridors and shafts, carved out of the soft volcanic tuff that underlies the Cappadocian landscape. Each level is connected to the ones above and below by narrow passages that could be sealed with large circular stone doors. Rolled into place from the inside, they were virtually impossible to force open from the outside, making the underground city an almost impregnable refuge during times of invasion or persecution. The ventilation system of Derinkuyu was remarkably sophisticated. Vertical shafts, some extending the full 85-metre depth of the city, provided a continuous flow of fresh air to the deepest levels. Water was supplied by wells that tapped into the underground water table, and waste was managed through a system of drainage channels and cesspits. The entire complex could function as a self-contained community for extended periods, weeks or even months, during which the inhabitants could live, cook, worship and carry on the essential activities of daily life entirely underground, invisible and unreachable by their enemies on the surface. The Qanat systems of ancient Persia represent another form of underground engineering. A qanat is a gently sloping underground channel that carries water from an aquifer or underground water source to the surface, using gravity alone. No pumps, no mechanical devices. The construction of a qanat begins with the digging of a mother well, a vertical shaft sunk into the ground at the point where the underground water table is closest to the surface. From the bottom of this well, a horizontal tunnel is excavated, sloping gently downward in the direction of the settlement or agricultural area that the qanat is intended to serve. Additional vertical shafts are sunk at regular intervals along the route of the tunnel, serving as access points for maintenance and as ventilation openings. The construction of a qanat was dangerous and highly specialised work, carried out by teams of trained tunnellers known as mekanis. The tunnels were narrow, typically about 1 metre high and half a metre wide, and the risk of collapse was constant. The mekanis worked in conditions of near total darkness, navigating by touch and by the sound of dripping water, using simple hand tools to dig through earth and rock. Despite these hazards, the qanat system proved to be one of the most effective and sustainable water supply technologies ever developed. Many qanats that were constructed more than 2,000 years ago are still in operation today, supplying water to communities across the arid regions of Iran, Afghanistan, and North Africa. The total length of the qanat system in Iran alone is estimated at approximately 270,000 kilometres, more than 6 times the circumference of the Earth. The ancient world also produced remarkable achievements in timber construction, a subject that receives less attention than stone construction, partly because timber structures are less likely to survive the passage of centuries, and partly because the stone structures of the ancient world are simply more dramatic and photogenic. But timber was, for much of human history, the most important building material on Earth, and the skills involved in working with it were no less sophisticated than those required for stone. In ancient Japan, the timber construction tradition reached levels of refinement that have never been surpassed. Japanese temple and palace architecture is based on a post and beam structural system, in which vertical posts support horizontal beams, with the roof load transmitted through the frame to the foundations without the need for load-bearing walls. The joints that connect the various members of the frame are masterpieces of three-dimensional geometry, interlocking assemblies of mortises, tenons, wedges and pegs that fit together with the precision of a Chinese puzzle box and the strength of bolted steel. The 5-story pagoda at Horyuji, which we mentioned earlier, is the oldest surviving wooden building in the world, dating from the early 7th century CE. Its survival for more than 1,300 years, through typhoons, earthquakes and the humid Japanese climate that rapidly destroys untreated wood, is a testament to the extraordinary skill of its builders. The timber was selected with care, each piece chosen for its strength, its grain pattern, and its resistance to rot. The joints were cut with precision, using a variety of specialised hand tools, saws, chisels, planes and draw knives that allowed the carpenters to shape each piece to tolerances of less than a millimetre. The pagoda's central column, or shinbashira, is one of the most ingenious structural features in the history of architecture. Rather than being rigidly fixed to the surrounding floors, the Shinbashira hangs freely from the top of the pagoda, its base resting on a foundation stone but not rigidly attached to it. During an earthquake, the Shinbashira sways independently of the surrounding structure, acting as a counterbalance that dampens the building's oscillation and prevents it from swaying too far in any one direction. This principle, essentially a primitive form of tuned mass damper, was rediscovered by modern engineers in the 20th century and is now used in the design of skyscrapers and other tall buildings around the world. The engineers at the Taipei 101 skyscraper in Taiwan, for example, installed a massive 730-ton steel pendulum near the top of the building to serve the same damping function that the Shinbashira provides at Horyuji. The ancient Japanese carpenters, working with nothing but wood and intuition, anticipated modern seismic engineering by more than 1,000 years. Let us also reflect on what ancient construction reveals about the organisation of labour in pre-modern societies. The building of a monumental structure was not just an engineering project, it was a social project, an undertaking that required the coordination of thousands of people across months or years, and that both reflected and reinforced the social structures of the civilization that produced it. In ancient Egypt, the organisation of the pyramid-building workforce has been reconstructed in remarkable detail from archaeological and textual evidence. The workers were organised into a hierarchical system of gangs, divisions, and filers, rotating groups, each with its own overseer and its own area of responsibility. At the top of the hierarchy was the vizier, the pharaoh's chief minister, who served as the overall director of the project. Below the vizier were the overseers of works, senior officials who coordinated the activities of the various departments. Below them were the foremen of the individual gangs, who supervised the day-to-day work of quarrying, transporting, and placing the stones. The logistical infrastructure that supported the workforce was as impressive as the pyramid itself. The workers' settlement at Giza contained not only dormitories and dining halls, but also specialised workshops for the production and repair of tools, bakeries that produced thousands of loaves of bread per day, breweries that produced hundreds of gallons of beer, which was a dietary staple in ancient Egypt, not merely a recreational drink, and fishing operations that processed fresh and dried fish for distribution to the workforce. The scale of this support operation was enormous, and its efficiency speaks to the organisational capabilities of the Egyptian state at the height of the Old Kingdom. The Roman construction industry was organised differently but no less efficiently. The Romans developed a sophisticated system of contracting, in which government officials would issue specifications for public building projects and then award contracts to private builders who would hire and manage their own workforces. This system, remarkably similar to modern construction contracting, allowed the Roman state to maintain a high volume of construction activity without the need to employ a permanent labour force. The builders themselves were often former soldiers, freed slaves, or members of the collegia, professional guilds that regulated entry into the building trades and maintained standards of quality and training. In the Inca Empire, the Mita labour system we discussed earlier was the primary mechanism for mobilising construction workers. Under the Mita, every able-bodied male citizen was required to contribute a certain amount of labour to the state each year, typically about 65 days, though the exact amount varied. This labour could take many forms: military service, agricultural work, road construction, building construction, or various other state projects. The Mita was not slavery. The workers were citizens fulfilling a civic obligation, and they were fed, housed, and given chicha, corn beer, by the state during their period of service. The system was efficient and equitable, and it provided the Inca with an enormous flexible labour force that could be deployed wherever it was needed, building roads through the mountains, constructing terraces for agriculture, or raising the walls of great temples and fortresses. The ancient world's relationship with water, not just as a challenge to be managed, but as a tool to be harnessed, represents one of the most fascinating chapters in the history of construction. We have already spoken of aqueducts and cisterns, of canals and drainage systems, but there is another dimension to this story that deserves our attention: the use of water as a fundamental element in the construction process itself. In Egypt, as we discussed earlier, water was used to level the foundation of the Great Pyramid, channels filled with water providing a perfectly horizontal reference line against which the rock surface could be trimmed. But this was only the beginning. Water played a role at nearly every stage of pyramid construction. It lubricated the sledge tracks along which the stones were dragged. It was used to test the flatness of stone surfaces. A thin film of water poured onto a dressed stone face would reveal even minute irregularities as the water pooled in depressions and flowed away from high spots. It was used in the quarrying process, both to cool the copper tools that were being used to cut the stone and to soak the wooden wedges that were driven into cracks to split blocks free from the bedrock. In ancient Peru, the Inca used water in equally sophisticated ways. At the fortress of Ollantaytambo, in the sacred valley of the Urubamba River, enormous blocks of red porphyry were quarried from a site high on the mountainside above the valley floor. To transport these blocks, some weighing as much as 50 tons, down the mountainside and across the river to the construction site, the Inca constructed an elaborate system of ramps and channels. But at the river crossing they faced a challenge: how to move 50-ton stones across a fast-flowing mountain river. The solution, as reconstructed by archaeologists, was elegant. The Inca diverted the river itself, channeling its flow through a series of constructed waterways that allowed the stones to be dragged across the dry riverbed. Once the stones had been moved, the river was returned to its original course. The entire operation required not just engineering skill, but an intimate understanding of hydrology, the behaviour of water in flowing systems, that the Inca had developed over centuries of managing the complex waterways of the Andean landscape. The ancient Nabateans, the builders of Petra, were perhaps the most remarkable water engineers of the ancient Near East. Petra is located in one of the driest regions on Earth, receiving only about 150 millimeters of rainfall per year. Yet the Nabateans supported a thriving city of perhaps 30,000 people in this arid wasteland by developing one of the most sophisticated water collection and distribution systems of the ancient world. They carved channels into the cliff faces to capture rainwater runoff, built dams across wadis, dry riverbeds, to trap flash flood waters, and constructed a network of clay pipes and stone-lined channels to transport water from collection points to cisterns and reservoirs located throughout the city. The system was so well designed that it could capture and store virtually every drop of rain that fell within the city's catchment area, providing a reliable water supply even during prolonged dry periods. The Nabatean water system at Petra also served a defensive purpose. By controlling the water supply, the rulers of Petra controlled access to the city itself. Any army attempting to besiege Petra would find itself in a waterless desert, while the city's inhabitants could survive for months on their stored water supplies. This strategic advantage, combined with the natural defensibility of Petra's narrow canyon entrance, made the city virtually impregnable, a factor that contributed significantly to the Nabateans' prosperity and independence for more than 3 centuries. Let us also expand our understanding of the remarkable precision that ancient builders achieved in their measurements and alignments. The precision of ancient construction has often been cited as evidence of mysterious or superhuman capabilities, but in reality, it is evidence of something far more impressive: the extraordinary refinement of simple techniques through centuries of practice. The Egyptian concept of the Sikhed, the horizontal distance for every unit of vertical rise, was essentially a system for defining and maintaining the slope of a pyramid's face. The second was expressed in palms and fingers, fractions of a royal cubit, and by specifying a particular sect for a pyramid, the architect could ensure that every course of stones was laid at the correct angle, maintaining a consistent slope from base to summit. The beauty of the sect system was its simplicity. Any worker armed with a measuring rod and a plumb line could verify that the stones he was placing were at the correct angle, without needing to understand the mathematical theory behind the measurement. The system distributed the quality control function across the entire workforce, ensuring consistent results without requiring centralized supervision of every individual block. The Roman use of modular planning, designing buildings on a grid of standardized dimensions, was another technique that ensured precision through simplicity. Roman architects typically designed their buildings using a basic module, often the diameter of a column at its base, from which all other dimensions were derived as simple multiples or fractions. This modular approach meant that every dimension in the building was related to every other dimension by a simple mathematical ratio, making it easy for builders to verify their work and catch errors before they became embedded in the structure. The Maya developed a system of measurement based on the human body that was remarkably consistent across their civilization. The basic unit was the cab, approximately the distance from the elbow to the tip of the fingers, roughly 46 centimeters, and larger units were defined as multiples of the cab. Maya buildings were designed using these standardized body-based measurements and the consistency of the results. Buildings constructed centuries apart and hundreds of kilometers distant from one another display remarkably similar proportions and dimensions, is evidence of a well-established and widely disseminated system of architectural planning. The transfer of construction knowledge across generations and across cultures is another fascinating aspect of this story. Building techniques did not develop in isolation. They spread through trade, conquest, cultural exchange, and the migration of skilled workers. The spread of the arch from the ancient Near East to the Roman world is a case in point. The arch was known in Mesopotamia and Egypt from a very early period, but it was used primarily for underground structures, drains, tunnels, and tomb passages, where the surrounding earth provided lateral support. It was the Etruscans, the predecessors of the Romans in central Italy, who first used the arch extensively in above-ground structures, including city gates, bridges, and aqueducts. The Romans, who conquered the Etruscans in the 4th and 3rd centuries BCE, adopted and refined Etruscan arch construction techniques, eventually developing them into the sophisticated system of arches, vaults, and domes that became the hallmark of Roman architecture. The transfer of hydraulic concrete technology from the Romans to the Byzantines is another example. When the Western Roman Empire collapsed in the 5th century CE, much Roman construction knowledge was lost in Western Europe, but it survived in the Eastern Roman Empire, where Byzantine builders continued to use Roman techniques for centuries. The great domed churches of the Byzantine Empire, including the Hagia Sophia in Constantinople, one of the most spectacular buildings ever constructed, were built using techniques that were directly descended from Roman practice, adapted and refined by generations of Byzantine engineers. The cross-cultural exchange of construction knowledge along the Silk Road and the Indian Ocean trade routes is another story that deserves more attention than it typically receives. The architectural traditions of China, India, Southeast Asia, and the Islamic world were not developed in isolation. They were shaped by centuries of cultural exchange as ideas, techniques, and aesthetic principles travelled along with the goods and people that moved along these ancient trade routes. The distinctive onion-shaped domes of Central Asian Islamic architecture, for example, are thought to have been influenced by both Persian and Indian architectural traditions. The elaborate timber bracket systems used in Chinese and Japanese temple architecture may have been influenced by similar systems developed in the Greco-Buddhist architecture of ancient Gandhara in what is now Pakistan and Afghanistan. The story of ancient construction is, in the end, a story about human connection, about the way that ideas and skills and aspirations pass from person to person, from generation to generation, from culture to culture, accumulating and evolving over centuries and millennia until they produce achievements that seem, to later observers, almost miraculous. But they are not miracles. They are the products of human intelligence, human creativity, and human cooperation, the same qualities that produced the first rough shelters at the dawn of civilization and that continue to drive the construction of new structures today. Every great building is a conversation across time, a dialogue between past and future, between the builders who conceived it and the generations who will inhabit it, between the culture that produced it and the cultures that will inherit it. The pyramids speak to us across 45 centuries, and we understand them, not perfectly, not completely, but well enough to marvel at what they represent. The Parthenon speaks to us across 25 centuries, and we hear in its proportions the same sense of beauty and order that its architects intended. The Colosseum speaks to us across 20 centuries, and we feel in its massive arches the same sense of power and spectacle that its builders sought to create. These structures are our inheritance. They belong to all of us, to every human being who has ever looked at a great building and felt a surge of wonder, a catch of the breath, a whispered question. How did they do that? The answer, as we have seen, is always the same. They did it with their hands, their minds, and their hearts. They did it with patience. They did it with skill. They did it with an unwavering belief that the work was worth doing. And the structures they built, massive, magnificent, and enduring, are the proof that they were right. And there is yet another dimension to the story of ancient construction that we must not overlook: the role of failure. For every structure that has survived to the present day, there were countless others that did not. Buildings that collapsed during construction, walls that crumbled within a generation, dams that burst, bridges that fell. The ancient builders did not possess some magical immunity to error. They made mistakes, they miscalculated, they underestimated the forces they were working with, and when they failed, the consequences could be catastrophic. The bent pyramid at Dashur, built by the pharaoh Sneferu around 2600 BCE, is perhaps the most famous example of an ancient construction error, and one of the most instructive. The bent pyramid gets its name from its distinctive profile. The lower portion rises at a steep angle of approximately 54 degrees, but at about the midway point, the angle abruptly changes to a much shallower 43 degrees, giving the pyramid a noticeably bent appearance. The most widely accepted explanation for this change in angle is that the builders realized, partway through construction, that the original angle was too steep, that the weight of the upper courses was causing internal stresses that threatened to destabilize the structure. Rather than continuing upward at the original angle and risking a catastrophic collapse, they reduced the slope, sacrificing the pyramid's intended proportions in order to ensure its structural integrity. The bent pyramid is often cited as evidence that the art of pyramid building was developed through trial and error, that the Egyptians learned to build pyramids by building pyramids, and that each successive structure incorporated the lessons learned from the last. Sneferu himself built at least 3 pyramids during his reign, each one representing an improvement on the last. The Meidum Pyramid, which may have partially collapsed during or shortly after construction. The Bent Pyramid, which was completed but with its compromised profile. And the Red Pyramid, which was built from the start at the shallower angle of 43 degrees and is the first true smooth-sided pyramid in history. The Red Pyramid's success laid the groundwork for Sneferu's son Khufu to build the Great Pyramid at Giza, the culmination of 3 generations of progressively more ambitious and more successful construction experiments. The lesson of the bent pyramid is profound, that failure is not the opposite of achievement but its necessary precondition. The ancient builders did not achieve perfection on their first attempt. They achieved it through a process of continuous improvement, building, observing, learning from their mistakes, and building again, better each time. This iterative process, this willingness to fail, to learn, and to try again, is the true secret of ancient construction. It is not a secret at all, really. It is simply the way that human beings have always learned to do difficult things, one stone at a time, one lesson at a time, one generation at a time. The Roman architectural writer Vitruvius, in his famous treatise De Architectura, warned his fellow architects against arrogance and overconfidence, reminding them that even the greatest builders of the past had made mistakes, and that the only defense against error was humility, careful observation, and a willingness to learn from the experience of others. This advice, written more than 2,000 years ago, remains as relevant today as it was then. The ancient builders were great not because they never failed, but because they never stopped learning from their failures. We see this same pattern everywhere in the ancient world. The early Chinese walls, built of rammed earth, often crumbled within a few generations, but each collapse taught the builders something about soil composition, compaction techniques, and the effects of weather, and these lessons were incorporated into the next generation of walls. The early Maya reservoirs sometimes leaked, but each failure led to improvements in the clay and plaster lining techniques that eventually produced waterproof cisterns capable of holding millions of litres for decades. The early Japanese pagodas sometimes fell in earthquakes, but each collapse revealed something about the relationship between structural rigidity and seismic damage, leading eventually to the development of the flexible frame systems that have kept later pagodas standing for more than 1,000 years. Failure, in other words, was not the enemy of ancient construction, it was its teacher, and the ancient builders were among the most attentive students in history. The cultural significance of ancient construction cannot be overstated. Every monumental structure was, for the civilization that built it, far more than a collection of stones and timbers. It was a statement, a declaration addressed to the present, the future, and the gods, that this people had achieved something extraordinary, something worthy of permanence, something that would outlast the fleeting lives of its builders and endure as a witness to their ambition, their faith, and their skill. The pyramids of Egypt were not merely tombs, they were resurrection machines, structures designed to facilitate the pharaoh's journey to the afterlife and to ensure the continued prosperity and well-being of the Egyptian state. The pharaoh's body, preserved by mummification and surrounded by the provisions and treasures he would need in the next world, lay at the heart of the pyramid like a seed in the centre of a fruit, protected, nourished, waiting to burst forth into eternal life. The pyramid itself, with its 4 triangular faces pointing toward the cardinal directions and its apex reaching toward the sky, was a symbolic representation of the primeval mound, the first land that emerged from the waters of chaos at the moment of creation, according to Egyptian mythology. By building a pyramid, the pharaoh was reenacting the moment of creation itself, establishing his tomb as the centre of the universe and the axis around which the cosmic order evolved. The temples of ancient Greece served a different but equally profound purpose. A Greek temple was not a place of congregational worship, as a modern church or mosque might be. It was the dwelling place of a god, a sacred house, designed to contain the cult statue of the deity to whom it was dedicated. The faithful did not enter the temple to pray. They gathered outside in the temenos, sacred precinct that surrounded it, and offered their sacrifices and prayers on an altar that stood before the temple's entrance. The temple itself, with its precisely proportioned columns, its sculpted pediments, its polished marble surfaces, was the god's private residence, as carefully and beautifully furnished as any mortal king's palace. The proportions of a Greek temple were not arbitrary. They were governed by a system of mathematical relationships, ratios and modules, that the Greeks believed reflected the fundamental harmony of the universe. The relationship between the diameter of a column and its height, between the spacing of the columns and the width of the facade, between the height of the entablature and the height of the columns, all of these were determined by mathematical formulas that were both aesthetically pleasing and structurally sound. The Greeks believed that beauty was a function of proportion, and that correct proportion was a reflection of cosmic truth. A well-proportioned temple was therefore not merely beautiful, it was true, a faithful representation, in stone and marble, of the mathematical order that underlay all of creation. Roman construction, while deeply influenced by Greek aesthetic principles, added a new dimension to the cultural significance of building, the expression of political power. The great public buildings of Rome, the forums, the basilicas, the triumphal arches, the amphitheatres, the baths, were not merely functional structures. They were instruments of imperial propaganda, designed to awe the populace with the wealth, power, and generosity of the emperor who commissioned them. The Colosseum, with its capacity for 50,000 to 80,000 spectators and its elaborate spectacles, was a demonstration of imperial munificence, a gift from the emperor to the people that simultaneously reminded them of his power to give or withhold. The great aqueducts and roads, which provided essential services to millions of people across the empire, reinforced the message that the Roman state was the source of civilization, order, and prosperity, and that without it, all would be chaos and barbarism. The symbolic geometry of ancient buildings extended to their orientation and placement within the landscape. Many ancient structures were deliberately positioned to align with celestial events, the rising or setting of the sun, the moon, or specific stars at particular times of the year. We have already noted the solstice alignment at Stonehenge and the equinox alignment at Angkor Wat. But these are only two examples of a practice that was widespread throughout the ancient world. The Egyptian pyramids, as we have seen, are aligned to the cardinal points with extraordinary precision. But recent research has suggested that their orientation may have been determined not by the stars alone, but by specific calendrical or astronomical events. The archaeologist Kate Spence has proposed that the pyramids were aligned by sighting on two stars in the constellation Ursa Minor, Kochab and Mizar, which, due to the precession of the Earth's axis, would have appeared to revolve symmetrically around the celestial North Pole during the period of pyramid construction. By sighting on these two stars at the moment they appeared to form a vertical line, the Egyptian surveyors could have established a precise north-south axis. The slight variations in the alignment of different pyramids at Giza are consistent with the gradual shift in the positions of these stars due to precession, providing indirect evidence for the date of each pyramid's construction. The Maya were perhaps the most sophisticated astronomical observers of the ancient world, and their buildings reflect this expertise to an extraordinary degree. The Great Pyramid, known as El Castillo at Chichen Itza, for example, is oriented so that on the spring and autumn equinoxes, the play of light and shadow on its northern staircase creates the illusion of a serpent descending from the temple at the summit to the ground below. A dramatic visual effect that was clearly deliberate, as the pyramid's orientation, proportions, and the design of its staircase all had to be precisely calibrated to produce it. The Maya also incorporated numerical symbolism into their architecture. El Castillo has 4 stairways, each with 91 steps, for a total of 364 steps. Adding the platform at the summit gives a total of 365, the number of days in the solar year. Whether this was intentional or coincidental is debated, but given the Mayas' extraordinary sophistication in calendar keeping and astronomy, intentionality seems far more likely than coincidence. The symbolic dimensions of ancient construction extended beyond astronomy to encompass a wide range of cultural and religious meanings. In many ancient civilizations, the very act of building was understood as a form of world creation, a human echo of the divine act by which the gods had brought the universe into being. In Hindu cosmology, as expressed in the Vastu Shastras, a temple is a microcosm of the universe. Its foundation represents the earth, its walls represent the atmosphere, and its tower represents the heavens. The construction of a temple is therefore an act of cosmic creation, a human construction that participates in and reaffirms the divine order of the cosmos. This understanding of building as a sacred act helps to explain why ancient builders lavished such extraordinary care on their work. The precision of Egyptian stonework, the mathematical refinement of Greek architecture, the intricate carving of Khmer temples, all of these reflect not just technical skill, but devotional commitment. These builders were not merely constructing buildings, they were constructing statements of faith. Every stone, every joint, every carved detail was an offering to the gods, a demonstration that the builders considered their work worthy of divine attention, and that they were willing to spend years or decades of their lives to get it right. Let us also consider the role of landscape and geography in shaping ancient construction practices. The materials available, the terrain, the climate, all of these factors influence not just the methods, but the very conception of the structures that were built. In the arid regions of the Middle East and North Africa, where stone and mud were abundant but timber was scarce, builders developed traditions based on massive stonework and mud brick construction. The thick walls of these structures provided insulation against the extreme temperature swings of the desert climate, keeping interiors cool during the day and warm during the night. The narrow windows and small doorways minimized exposure to the sun while allowing air to circulate through the interior. In the humid tropics of Southeast Asia, where timber was abundant and stone was often soft and easily carved, builders developed traditions based on timber frame construction with stone decoration. The great wooden palaces and monasteries of Burma, Thailand and Laos, few of which survive today, were among the most elaborate timber structures ever built, with soaring multi-tiered roofs, intricately carved walls, and gilded surfaces that shimmered in the tropical light. In the earthquake-prone regions of the Pacific Rim, Japan, Indonesia, the Andes, builders developed traditions based on flexibility and resilience, using interlocking joints, dry stone masonry, and other techniques that allowed their structures to absorb seismic energy without fracturing. The survival of these structures through centuries of earthquakes is proof of the effectiveness of their approaches. In the cold, wet climates of northern Europe, where timber was the primary building material and stone was available mainly in mountainous regions, builders developed traditions based on timber frame construction, with thatch or turf roofing. The great timber halls of the Viking Age, massive rectangular buildings, some more than 50 meters long, supported by rows of timber posts and roofed with thick layers of turf that provided excellent insulation against the cold, were among the most impressive timber structures of the medieval period. Each of these regional traditions represents a distinct response to the challenges and opportunities presented by the local environment, and each tradition, in its own way, demonstrates the same fundamental truth, that human beings, when confronted with the need to build, will find a way, adapting their methods, their materials, and their designs to the specific conditions they face, and producing in the process structures of extraordinary beauty, durability, and ingenuity. The legacy of ancient construction extends far beyond the physical structures that have survived to the present day. The techniques developed by ancient builders laid the foundations, literally and figuratively, for all subsequent developments in architecture and engineering. The arch, the vault, the dome, the post and beam frame, the ramp, the lever, the pulley, the crane, all of these were developed or refined by ancient builders, and all of them remain fundamental to construction today. Modern engineering, for all its sophistication, is built upon principles that were first discovered and applied by people who had no formal education in physics or mathematics, no computers, no sophisticated measuring instruments, nothing but their hands, their eyes, their minds, and the accumulated wisdom of generations of builders who had come before them. When a modern engineer designs a bridge, she is drawing on principles of structural mechanics that were first intuited by the Roman builders of the Pont de Garde. When a modern architect designs a skyscraper, he's applying principles of load distribution and lateral stability that were first worked out by the Egyptian builders of the pyramids. When a modern seismic engineer designs an earthquake-resistant building, she is refining techniques that were first developed by the Japanese carpenters of Horyuji and the Inca masons of Machu Picchu. The ancient builders were not primitive versions of ourselves, struggling with inadequate tools toward goals that we have since surpassed. They were masters of their craft, working within the constraints of their technology to achieve results that, in many cases, we are still unable to match. The precision of Egyptian stonework, the durability of Roman concrete, the earthquake resistance of Inca masonry, the longevity of Japanese timber construction, all of these represent standards of excellence that modern builders can learn from and aspire to. And perhaps the most important lesson that the ancient builders have to teach us is not a technical one at all, but a philosophical one. It is the lesson of patience, the understanding that the greatest achievements are not accomplished in a hurry, but through years and decades and generations of steady, careful, dedicated work. The Great Pyramid took approximately 20 years to build. Angkor Wat took approximately 35 years. The Great Wall of China took more than 2,000 years. Stonehenge evolved over a period of 1,500 years. These structures were not the products of impatience or haste. They were the products of a kind of civilizational patience that we, in our modern world of quarterly reports and 24-hour news cycles, can scarcely imagine. There is something profoundly humbling about standing before an ancient structure and realizing that the people who built it were willing to devote their entire lives to a project that they knew they would never see completed. The architect who designed the Great Pyramid knew that he would not live to see the final capstone placed. The labourers who laid the first courses of the Great Wall knew that the wall would not reach its full extent for centuries after their deaths. The master masons who carved the first stones of a Gothic cathedral, which, while medieval rather than ancient, inherited much from ancient building traditions, knew that the building would not be completed for 200 years or more, and yet they built. They built not for themselves, not for their own generation, but for a future that they would never see. They built because they believed that some things are worth building even if you will not be the one to enjoy them. They built because they understood, in a way that our modern world sometimes seems to have forgotten, that the measure of a civilization is not what it consumes but what it creates, not the pleasures it offers to the living but the legacy it leaves to the unborn. This is perhaps the deepest and most enduring lesson of ancient construction, that building is an act of faith, faith in the future, faith in the possibility that the world we leave behind will be better, more beautiful, more enduring than the world we found. Faith that the work of our hands, however humble, however imperfect, is worthy of the time and effort we invest in it, and faith that the structures we build, whether they are pyramids or pagodas, temples or tunnels, walls or waterways, will stand as witnesses to our having been here long after we ourselves have passed away. The ancient builders understood this. They understood that stone, properly cut and carefully placed, can outlast empires. They understood that a well-made building is not just a shelter but a statement, a declaration that human beings have the intelligence, the creativity and the courage to reshape the world according to their vision. And they understood that the greatest honour they could pay to the future was to build something that would last, something that would still be standing, still be beautiful, still be awe-inspiring, thousands of years after the last of them had drawn their final breath. And so they built, with copper chisels and stone hammers, with ropes and levers and sledges, with patience and skill and an unshakable belief in the value of their work. They raised the pyramids and the temples, the walls and the aqueducts, the palaces and the tombs that have defined the landscape of human civilization for millennia. They built without electricity, without steel, without computers, without any of the technologies that we consider essential to modern construction. And what they built has endured. That, in the end, is the answer to the question with which we began this journey. How were these massive buildings actually built? They were built by people, not by aliens, not by lost civilizations, not by any supernatural force. By people, intelligent, determined, creative, patient people who understood the properties of stone, who mastered the principles of leverage and gravity and friction, who organized their labor with military precision, and who were willing to dedicate years of their lives to the creation of something greater than themselves. And now, as we near the end of this long journey through the ages, let us take a moment to simply breathe and reflect on all that we have seen. We have stood in the shadow of the Great Pyramid, watching the last of the casing stones being polished to a mirror finish, while the desert wind stirred the sand at our feet. We have walked among the great sarsen stones of Stonehenge, feeling their rough surfaces beneath our fingers and imagining the moment, more than 4,000 years ago, when the first of those enormous pillars was hauled upright against the pale English sky. We have climbed the terraces of Machu Picchu, feeling the thin mountain air in our lungs and marvelling at the seamless precision of walls that have withstood 5 centuries of earthquakes without a single stone falling from its place. We have walked through the arched corridors of the Colosseum, imagining the roar of the crowd and the complexity of the machinery that made the spectacles possible. We have drifted through the waterways of Angkor, watching the reflections of towering stone temples ripple in the still water of the Berais. We have walked along the Great Wall of China, feeling the wind that blows from the steppe, and looking out across a landscape that humans have been shaping and defending for more than 2,000 years. And along the way, we have met the people who made all of this possible, the architects and engineers, the stonemasons and carpenters, the labourers and administrators, the priests and astronomers who together, across thousands of years and dozens of civilizations, transformed the raw materials of the earth into some of the most extraordinary structures the world has ever seen. What strikes me most, after all of this, is not the scale of what they accomplished, though the scale is staggering. It is not the precision of their work, though the precision is, in many cases, humbling. It is not even the ingenuity of their solutions, though the ingenuity is endlessly fascinating. What strikes me most is the patience. These were people who thought in decades, in centuries, in millennia. They did not build for the quarterly report or the fiscal year. They built for eternity. And the remarkable thing is that, In many cases, they succeeded. The structures they built have endured for thousands of years, through wars and earthquakes, through floods and droughts, through the rise and fall of empires and the slow, grinding passage of time. They are still here. They are still standing, and they are still, after all these millennia, beautiful. There is a quiet wisdom in that patience that speaks to something fundamental about the human condition. We are all of us temporary beings, passing through a world that existed long before us and will continue long after we are gone. We cannot stop time, we cannot defeat death, but we can build. We can shape stone and timber and brick into forms that outlast us, that carry something of our vision and our values into a future we will never see. And in doing so, we participate in something larger than ourselves, something that transcends the boundaries of a single life, a single generation, a single civilization. Every ancient structure that still stands is a message from the past, a voice speaking to us across the centuries saying, "We were here, we lived, and we worked, and we built. We faced challenges that seemed impossible, and we overcame them. We made something beautiful, something enduring, something that mattered, and we left it for you." The pyramids speak this message. The temples speak it. The walls and aqueducts and harbours speak it. Every carefully shaped stone, every precisely cut joint, every elegant arch and soaring dome speaks it. We were here. We did this. And it was worth doing. When you look at the Great Pyramid and wonder how it was built, you're looking at the answer to a deeper question. A question about what human beings are capable of when they set aside their differences, pool their resources, and commit themselves to a shared vision. The answer, as the ancient builders demonstrated again and again across centuries and continents, is almost anything. The stones of the ancient world were moved not by magic but by method, not by superhuman strength but by human ingenuity, not by advanced technology but by basic physics, the lever, the inclined plane, the wheel, the pulley, applied with extraordinary intelligence and extraordinary patience. The precision that amazes us was achieved not with laser measurement but with plumb lines and water levels and careful human eyes. The organisation that sustained the great construction projects was achieved not with software and spreadsheets, but with papyrus rolls and clay tablets and the iron discipline of a well-managed workforce. Everything that the ancient builders accomplished, they accomplished with tools and methods that we can understand. There is no mystery in their achievements that requires a supernatural explanation. The only thing that is required, the only ingredient that cannot be replicated by any machine, is the human will to build. The stubborn, unreasonable, magnificent determination to take stone from the earth and shape it into something that will stand forever. And that determination is still with us. It is the same impulse that drives the modern architect to design a building that will inspire awe, the same impulse that drives the bridge engineer to span a valley that no one has spanned before, the same impulse that drives the mason to lay each brick with care and attention and pride. We are the inheritors of a tradition that stretches back to the very dawn of civilization, a tradition of building, of shaping, of creating. And every structure we raise, from the humblest cottage to the tallest skyscraper, is a continuation of the story that began 12,000 years ago on a hilltop in southern Turkey, when a group of hunter-gatherers decided to build something that would outlast them. The ancient structures that we have explored tonight are not just monuments to the past, they are invitations to the future. They challenge us to think beyond the immediate, to plan beyond the quarterly, to build beyond the lifetime. They remind us that the greatest things in life, the things that truly endure, are never accomplished in a hurry. They require patience. They require dedication. They require the willingness to do difficult work day after day, year after year, with no guarantee of recognition or reward, sustained only by the quiet conviction that the work itself is worth doing. The ancient builders knew this. They understood that building is not just a practical activity, but a moral one, an expression of our highest values, our deepest aspirations, our most enduring hopes. And the structures they built, the pyramids and temples, the walls and roads, the domes and arches and vaults, stand today as proof that those values, those aspirations, those hopes were justified. They built well. They built with care. They built with a skill and a patience that we, in our age of machines and haste, can only admire and try to emulate. And the structures they built have outlasted the civilizations that created them, the languages that named them, the religions that consecrated them, and the empires that once ruled over them. The stones remain, the arches stand, the walls endure, and across the millennia they speak to us in a language that transcends words, a language of proportion and precision, of weight and balance, of mass and space and light. They speak of human hands and human minds. They speak of what we are capable of at our best, and they speak of a faith, not in gods or kings or empires, but in the simple, stubborn, glorious conviction that it is worth building something that will last. As I contemplate these structures, spread across continents and millennia, I am struck by a final thought, one that seems fitting as we come to the end of our journey. For all the differences between the civilizations we have visited, their languages, their beliefs, their customs, their technologies, they share one remarkable thing in common. They all, without exception, felt the urge to build, not just to shelter themselves from the rain, not just to store their grain or defend their borders, but to build something monumental, something that proclaimed to the universe, we were here and we mattered. From the oldest temple at Göbekli Tepe to the newer sections of the Great Wall, from the tropical forests of Cambodia to the frozen steppes of China, from the desert sands of Egypt to the cloud-wrapped peaks of Peru, everywhere that human beings have gathered in communities they have built. They have quarried stone and fired bricks, carved wood and mixed mortar, dug foundations and raised walls. They have done this in scorching heat and bitter cold, on mountain tops and in river valleys, in jungles and in deserts. And they have done it with a consistency, a persistence, and a devotion that suggests it is not merely a cultural preference, but a fundamental aspect of human nature itself. We are builders. It is what we do. It is, in some deep and essential way, what we are. And the ancient structures that dot the surface of our planet, weathered and worn but still standing, still magnificent, still capable of taking our breath away, are the proof. They were built by people, ordinary, extraordinary people, working together day after day, stone by stone, for years and decades and centuries. And what they built has endured. It has endured because it was built well, because it was built with care, because it was built with patience, and it has endured because in the end it was worth building. That is the story of ancient construction. That is the answer to the question we asked at the beginning of this journey, and it is a story that, like the structures themselves, will endure, not because it is written in stone, but because it is written in us, in our hands, our minds and our hearts, in our endless, restless, glorious determination to build something that will last.